Hello and welcome to Volume 8 of Horror Stories for Sleep with Rain. Hope you enjoy this episode and subscribe before falling asleep. The wind howled through the trees, an eerie sound that echoed through the barren landscape. The once thriving town of Hollow Creek now stood in ruin, its buildings crumbling like the remnants of a forgotten nightmare. The streets, once lined with laughter and life, were silent. A thick fog had settled over the town, obscuring everything within it. The kind of fog that made your skin crawl and your breath feel colder than it should be. In the center of it all, a house stood, unassuming, except for the whispers that had followed it for generations. The Blackthorn House. It was said to be cursed. No one had lived there for decades, but its presence loomed over Hollow Creek like a dark specter. Stories of strange happenings, of people disappearing without a trace, of odd noises in the dead of night. These were the things that kept the townsfolk from venturing near. And yet, there were always those who couldn't resist the pull of curiosity. It was to this house that Michael, an investigative journalist, had come. A man used to chasing the truth, no matter how dark or dangerous it might be. He had heard the stories. He had read the legends. But he wasn't here for the tales or the rumors. No, Michael had a single goal in mind: to uncover the truth behind the Blackthorn House, to prove once and for all that the supernatural could be explained away. The door creaked open as he stepped onto the rotting porch. His flashlight flickered in his hand, the beam casting long shadows across the cracked wooden floor. Every step he took seemed to echo unervingly in the empty space around him. The air was thick, heavy with dust and the scent of decay. His heart raced, though he refused to acknowledge it. Fear was something for the weak, something for those who let their imaginations run wild. He wasn't one of them. He was here for the facts, the truth, nothing more. He pushed the door open further, stepping into the hallway. The house was cold, its atmosphere thick with the oppressive weight of something that had once been alive but now was long dead. The walls, lined with peeling wallpaper, seemed to close in on him as he moved deeper into the house. Every room he passed seemed to whisper to him, voices muffled and indistinct, but undeniably present. Michael reached the staircase. The wooden steps groaned beneath his weight, protesting each step he took. He hesitated for a moment at the top, the darkness above him swallowing his flashlight's beam, but he pushed forward. His mind was set. Nothing would stop him now. At the end of the hallway, a door stood ajar. He approached it cautiously, his breath shallow in his chest. The floor creaked beneath his feet, and the door swung open with a disturbing ease. Inside was a bedroom, its contents covered in dust and cobwebs. The bed was empty, the sheets a faded yellow, but it was the other objects in the room that caught Michael's attention. An old rocking chair sat by the window, its seat gently swaying as if disturbed by an invisible force. A dresser stood against the wall, its drawers slightly ajar, revealing nothing but empty space. And in the corner of the room, facing the wall, stood a tall, thin mirror. It was the only thing in the room that didn't seem to have aged, its surface polished and reflecting the dim light from Michael's flashlight. He approached the mirror, his reflection distorted by the light. As he gazed into it, a strange unease settled in his stomach. There was something off about it, something that didn't belong. Then, without warning, the reflection shifted. Michael's breath caught in his throat. The room behind him seemed to twist and bend, the walls stretching impossibly. In the mirror, a figure emerged from the shadows, its outline blurred and indistinct. It was tall, thin, its movements jerky and unnatural. Michael spun around, heart pounding in his chest, but there was nothing behind him. Only the cold, empty room. The figure in the mirror had vanished. He staggered back, nearly tripping over a loose floorboard. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he tried to calm his breathing. The logical part of his mind screamed at him to leave, that it was all just a trick of the light, his mind playing games on him. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Before he could decide whether to leave or investigate further, a sudden noise echoed from downstairs, a low, guttural sound. Michael froze, his breath catching in his throat. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything he could explain away with logic. The noise grew louder, closer. Slowly, he turned back to the mirror, his gaze drawn to the glass once more. And that's when he saw it. A face, pale, hollow, its eyes dark and empty, pressed against the surface of the mirror. It was smiling, its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, its teeth jagged and sharp. Michael backed away, stumbling toward the door, but as he reached for the handle, the room seemed to close in on him. The walls shifted, the floor tilted beneath his feet, and the air grew thick with an oppressive weight. The mirror's reflection grew darker, the figure becoming more distinct. It stepped out of the mirror, its limbs twisting and contorting, its eyes locked on Michael. And then, just as the figure lunged toward him, the room went black. Michael awoke with a start. His body was cold, his heart hammering in his chest. He was no longer in the room. He was lying on the floor in the hallway, the same hallway he had entered earlier. The house was silent again, but something had changed. The air felt heavier, charged with an unseen presence. And then a voice, a whisper, echoed through the silence. "Welcome home." Michael's blood ran cold. The door slammed shut behind him, and in the darkness he understood. He was never leaving. The room seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. Michael's hands trembled as he reached out to touch the floor, his fingers brushing against the cold, damp wood. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat reverberating in his ears. He could feel the presence closing in, like something was waiting, watching, lurking just beyond his reach. His breath hitched as he slowly pushed himself to his feet, the silence pressing down on him like a vice. The whisper, faint but chilling, had come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It wasn't just a voice, it was a feeling, a sensation that wrapped itself around him like a suffocating fog. "Welcome home." The words replayed in his mind, but the meaning behind them was as elusive as the figure in the mirror. Was it real? Was he truly trapped? Or was his mind starting to unravel, finally succumbing to the dread that had been building ever since he stepped foot into this forsaken house? He glanced around, eyes darting to the empty doorway. The house was dark, save for the dim light from his flashlight. It flickered uncertainly as he took a slow step toward the stairs. He couldn't stay here. Not like this. He had to leave. He had to get out before whatever was here consumed him entirely. The air grew colder as he descended the stairs, his footsteps soft against the rotting wood. The oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of his breathing, shallow and uneven. He reached the bottom of the stairs and hesitated, feeling an unsettling pull toward the front door. But as his hand touched the handle, a sudden, violent force slammed into his chest, throwing him backward onto the floor. The flashlight tumbled from his hand, its beam casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. Before he could react, the darkness seemed to shift around him. The floor beneath him groaned, and a low, guttural growl filled the room. His eyes widened in terror as the shadows along the walls began to take shape, dark, twisted forms that writhed and slithered like insects. Something moved in the corner of his vision, a flicker of motion too fast for him to catch. His breath quickened, panic rising as the shadows stretched and contorted into figures, shifting and twisting into shapes that defied logic. He scrambled to his feet, heart racing, but before he could make it to the door, the shadows lunged forward. A cold, clammy hand grasped his ankle, pulling him back with an unnatural strength. He screamed, desperately trying to free himself, but the grip tightened, pulling him deeper into the darkness. The floor seemed to bend beneath him, the walls warping as though they were alive, closing in on him. His fingers scraped against the wooden planks as he tried to crawl away, but the shadows had already surrounded him. They were everywhere now, undulating shapes with no true form, just endless masses of blackness that pulsated with an almost malevolent energy. "Help me," Michael gasped, his voice barely a whisper as the dark tendrils snaked around him. His chest tightened as though the very air was being sucked out of the room. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, the weight of the darkness pressing against his body. A voice, low and breathy, echoed from the shadows. It wasn't the same whisper from before. This was deeper, darker, more threatening. "Too late," it hissed. "You've always belonged here." The words sent a shiver down his spine. His mind raced, trying to comprehend what was happening, but nothing made sense. The world around him seemed to be warping, bending under the pressure of something far worse than he could ever imagine. The shadows constricted tighter around him, choking him, suffocating him. He gasped for air, but it was as if the very space he occupied was being drained of life, leaving him helpless in the grip of whatever force had taken hold of the house. Then, as if on cue, the world went still. The pressure on his chest released. The shadows recoiled for a moment, as if waiting. Michael's mind buzzed with confusion. Was it over? Had they let him go? But the silence was unbearable, and his pulse quickened as he realized that the true horror wasn't in the darkness or the shadows themselves. It was in the silence. The complete, soul-crushing silence that now surrounded him. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet once again, but this time, it was not his movement. The sound came from somewhere deeper within the house. His stomach churned with dread, but he couldn't look away. The door, the very one he had tried to escape through, was no longer in front of him. Instead, the walls had shifted, and a narrow hallway stretched out before him, dimly lit by flickering candles. A silhouette stood at the far end of the hallway, a shadow that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. It was motionless, watching him with cold, lifeless eyes. And as Michael's breath caught in his throat, the figure slowly began to move. With each step it took, the air grew colder, heavier. The once silent house was now filled with the echo of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, unforgiving. Michael's legs felt like lead, but he forced himself to take a step forward, determined to face whatever lay ahead. He couldn't back down now. There was no going back. He didn't know what was waiting for him, but he knew one thing for certain. This house would never let him leave. "I don't want it to end yet, so rewrite it again." ChatGPT plus. ChatGPT. The figure's movement was slow, deliberate, its limbs stretching and bending unnaturally, like a shadow made flesh. Michael's heart pounded in his chest, a frantic rhythm that matched the wild thoughts racing through his mind. Each step it took felt like an eternity. It was getting closer, too close, and his instincts screamed at him to run, to flee, but his body refused to obey. The house felt alive, as though the walls themselves were closing in, suffocating him with a pressure he couldn't escape. The air was thick, cold, every breath coming in shallow gasps as Michael tried to steady himself. But the figure, whatever it was the only thing that seemed to matter now. He couldn't look away, couldn't take his eyes off it. As it drew closer, Michael's mind screamed at him to run, to do anything to escape, but his legs felt like they were made of stone, rooted to the floor, unable to move. The temperature continued to drop, the chill biting into his skin, his breath fogging the air in front of him. He was trapped, cornered, and with every second that passed, he could feel his sanity fraying at the edges. The figure moved like liquid, flowing rather than walking, its body an ever-shifting blur of darkness that stretched beyond what was physically possible. The space around it seemed to warp, bend, and twist with every movement, as though reality itself was breaking apart in its wake. Michael's vision was beginning to swim. His mind couldn't focus on anything other than the figure before him. It was close now, standing just a few feet away. He could feel the cold radiating from it, could smell the faint stench of decay, of something rotten and forgotten. And then it stopped. The figure's head tilted slightly, and Michael's stomach churned as he realized that the presence wasn't just physical. It was something else, something ancient, something far older than the house or even the land it stood on. It wasn't just a monster, or a ghost, or a mere hallucination. This was something that had always been there, waiting. The air grew thicker, the silence deafening, and then the whisper came. Low, guttural, like the murmur of 1,000 voices from a time long past. "Do you hear it?" the voice asked, reverberating in his skull. "The walls are always watching. The house is always listening." Michael couldn't respond. His body trembled uncontrollably, his mouth dry, and his throat so tight he could barely breathe. The house, it was alive. It was aware of him. It had been watching him since the moment he stepped through the door. He tried to move, tried to force his limbs to respond, but they wouldn't. His body was frozen in place, his mind spiraling into panic. "I don't understand," he managed to rasp, his voice barely a whisper, lost in the heavy silence. The figure leaned closer, and Michael could feel its presence invading his thoughts, like tendrils of darkness curling around his mind. The space between them closed, and the figure's face, a face that should not have been possible, materialized before him. It was featureless. No eyes, no mouth, just an empty void where a face should have been, an abyss that seemed to pull at his very soul. "You are part of the story now." The voice spoke again, the words seeping into his consciousness like poison. "Once you've entered, you can never leave. The house will never let you go." Michael's mind raced. He remembered the stories, the old rumors about places like this, places where the line between life and death was thin, where the house itself could claim its inhabitants, twisting them into something else. But he hadn't believed them. Not until now. The figure moved again, faster this time, its limbs snapping into place as it closed in on him, its presence suffocating. Michael gasped for air, but it felt like the very atmosphere was being drained away. A sharp, searing pain erupted in his chest. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, only the overwhelming pressure. The walls were closing in now, the room shrinking, warping. The floor beneath him seemed to twist and distort, like it was no longer solid, like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to fall into the unknown. The figure's voice was inside his mind now, swirling around him, overwhelming him. "You are the next part of the cycle," it whispered, its tone cold, clinical, as though this had all been predestined. "You will stay here. Forever." Michael's heart raced. He could feel the weight of the house, of the figure, of the ancient presence closing in on him, pressing down on him. The world around him was collapsing, and there was no way out. But just as he thought it was all over, the ground beneath him cracked. A deep, resonating sound, like the breaking of stone, filled the room, and the walls trembled. Michael's eyes widened as he saw a faint glow, a soft, almost imperceptible light, flickering in the distance, a small beacon in the overwhelming darkness. The figure's head snapped toward the light, and for a brief moment, there was something like hesitation in its movements. It turned back to Michael, its empty face mere inches away from his, the air thick with cold dread. "You think you can escape?" it hissed, its voice low and mocking. "There is no escape. You belong to us now." Michael's pulse quickened as the light grew stronger, brighter, cutting through the suffocating darkness. It wasn't a salvation, but it was something. And that something was enough to stir a flicker of hope in his chest. The figure hissed again, a sound like nails on a chalkboard, and Michael felt a sudden surge of adrenaline. His legs, numb with terror just moments ago, began to move. It wasn't much, but it was enough to push him toward the light. The house shook violently, as though it was fighting to hold him back. The walls groaned, cracking, splintering as though it were alive, desperate to drag him back into its suffocating embrace. But the light was growing, cutting through the darkness like a blade. For a moment, Michael dared to believe he could escape. But as his hand reached toward the light, the world around him shattered. Everything went black. The blackness was like a void, an infinite expanse that stretched on forever. No walls, no floor, no sense of direction. Just emptiness. For a moment, Michael didn't even know if he was still alive or if he had already crossed into whatever lay beyond death. His breath came in sharp, panicked gasps, and his chest ached from the absence of the pressure he had felt moments ago. Was the house still with him? The figure? He couldn't tell. There was nothing here but silence, and yet the silence felt as though it were alive, listening, watching. Then a sound. A faint hum, like a distant melody playing out of tune, echoed in the void. It was coming from somewhere, though Michael couldn't say where. It was just there, a subtle vibration that seemed to vibrate in his bones, in his very soul. And then he saw it. A single, small light flickered in the distance. It was nothing compared to the blinding glow he had seen before, but it was something. A point of clarity in a world that had been nothing but dark. Michael couldn't help himself. He moved toward it, his feet seemingly finding the ground even though it hadn't been there a moment ago. The light grew larger, its outline taking shape, but something wasn't right. The closer he got, the more distorted the light seemed to become. It warped and flickered, like a faulty bulb. The edges blurred and twisted, and Michael's heart began to pound again. Was this the same light from before? Or was this something else, something far more sinister? Suddenly, the void around him shifted. The walls began to appear again, but they weren't the walls of the house. They were something worse, something alien, something wrong. They were jagged, like the edges of a broken mirror, distorting his reflection as they warped and cracked. The light pulsed once, twice, and then he heard the sound again, the humming that had drawn him in. But this time, it wasn't just a hum. It was a voice, a whisper, low and guttural, seeping into his ears like a poison. Not yet. Michael stopped. His legs froze. His mind screamed, trying to make sense of what was happening, but all he could hear was that whisper, winding around his thoughts, squeezing them tight. Not yet, it repeated, the voice more insistent now. Then the light shattered, splintering like glass. The pieces fell away, one by one, disintegrating into the air like smoke, leaving Michael in a darkness far colder than before. The walls closed in around him, not from every direction, but in patches, like some sort of uneven dreamscape coming into focus. And then he heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, the sound of something heavy and persistent dragging itself toward him. He couldn't see what it was. His eyes were too frantic, too desperate to focus, but he could feel its presence. A weight in the air that pressed down on his chest, suffocating him. Michael's breath quickened as the footsteps grew louder, closer, the rhythmic sound reverberating in his skull. He tried to move again, but his body felt paralyzed, as though the very air around him was holding him in place, trapping him in an invisible cage. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Please, no more." But the footsteps didn't stop. They didn't even falter. There was a sickening familiarity to them, something that made Michael's stomach churn. And then it spoke. Not in words, but in a language older than any he knew. It was a sound that didn't make sense, yet somehow, in the deepest parts of his mind, it did. He understood it. He felt it. The walls trembled, and the air grew colder still. Michael's heart raced, his breath shallow as he struggled to make sense of the impossible. Suddenly, a deep, rumbling growl filled the space around him. It was like a vibration through the floor, crawling through his bones. The walls shifted again, this time growing jagged, the air thickening with something vile and suffocating. Michael couldn't tell if he was still dreaming or if he was awake. Nothing made sense. The footsteps kept coming, the low, guttural growl growing louder with each passing moment. It was coming for him. He didn't know what it was. Didn't know what was going to happen next. But he knew with an undeniable certainty that it was too late to turn back. Not yet, the voice whispered again, like a cruel promise. Then the world broke apart.
The letter arrived on a damp Tuesday morning, its edges worn and the paper stiff from age. Jack hadn't expected anything unusual to break the monotony of his life. But when he saw the envelope, something inside him stirred. It wasn't the fact that it was addressed to him. It was the handwriting, neat but unfamiliar, that caught his attention. The return address was blank. He hadn't received anything like it in years. He sat down at the kitchen table, unfolding the letter slowly. The paper smelled of mildew, a faint reminder of the dampness that clung to the world outside. His eyes scanned the words, each one drawing him deeper into something he couldn't yet grasp. You are invited to a place beyond your understanding. Come to the house at the edge of the world. It has waited for you. Jack read the lines twice. His first instinct was to dismiss it. Prank, perhaps. He had no enemies to speak of, but he had heard strange rumors in town over the years. Stories about people receiving letters like this, letters that called them to places they couldn't explain. But none of those rumors were ever real. They were just stories people told when they were bored or afraid. But this letter felt different. The words seemed to pulse with an energy that made his stomach twist. He had heard of the house, vague mentions, fleeting references in local folklore, whispers about a place that existed on the very edge of reality, where time and space blurred into something else entirely. But none of it made sense. It was absurd. Still, as he sat there, the letter in his hands, he felt a tug at his chest. Something compelled him to go. He had no idea what he was about to walk into, but it didn't matter. He couldn't resist. The idea of going to that house to see it for himself was now all he could think about. Jack had lived in a small town for most of his life. Quiet, isolated, with few things to break the monotony. He worked as a mechanic at the local garage, fixing cars that passed through, mostly from tourists who found their way to the nearby mountain range. It was the kind of town that people didn't visit unless they were lost, and most days he was content with that. The routine was comfortable, safe. But now, as he sat in his small apartment, he realized he wasn't happy. He hadn't been happy for years. He hadn't realized how empty his life had become until the letter arrived. Now it was as if something inside him had awakened. A long-buried curiosity, a need to escape the prison he'd built around himself. So he made his decision. The following day, he went to the train station without much thought, bought a one-way ticket with no real destination in mind. The letter hadn't given him much to go on, just the cryptic invitation. The house at the edge of the world. It wasn't a place marked on any map, nor did he have a name or a person to guide him there. It was as if the letter had pulled him into something much larger than himself, something he couldn't escape. The train ride was long, and the further he traveled, the more unsettled he became. The land outside the window grew unfamiliar, the terrain dark and desolate. The usual hum of the city faded into a strange, eerie silence. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being drawn deeper into some kind of trap, but the letter, the house, kept him going. After hours of travel, the train finally stopped at a small station in the middle of nowhere. The platform was deserted, and the air smelled of wet earth and decay. Jack stepped off the train, his boots crunching against the gravel. The world around him was still. The trees nearby looked twisted, their limbs reaching out like dark fingers, clawing at the sky. A sign above the platform read Edgewood. Jack had never heard of it. There was nothing here. No welcoming faces, no bustling streets, only an empty road stretching into the fog. And there, at the end of the road, looming like a specter, was a mansion. It was old, its stones weathered and cracked, but it stood tall and imposing. The house at the edge of the world. He could feel it in his bones now, the weight of it pressing on him, pulling him toward it. He had no choice but to walk toward it. The air grew colder with every step he took. The trees seemed to close in around him, and the fog thickened, swallowing the world whole. He couldn't see anything except the faint outline of the mansion ahead, its silhouette barely visible through the mist. When he reached the gates, they creaked open of their own accord, as if they had been waiting for him. He didn't hesitate. He stepped inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, a strange stillness settled over the place. No birds sang, no wind blew. There was only the eerie silence and the scent of decay in the air. The house was grand, its walls adorned with portraits of long-forgotten faces, their eyes seeming to follow him as he walked deeper into the entry hall. The floors creaked beneath his feet, and the house groaned with age, as though it were alive. He felt it then, the weight of history pressing down on him. The house had waited for him, just as the letter said. But why? And for what? A voice echoed through the halls. It was soft, a whisper at first, but it grew louder with each passing moment. It wasn't coming from any one place, but from all around him. It beckoned him, promising something, but Jack couldn't understand what it was saying. As he moved deeper into the house, the walls seemed to shift. The air grew heavier, colder. The floor beneath his feet seemed to buckle, and the portraits on the walls twisted into grotesque, distorted shapes, their eyes bulging, mouths open in silent screams. He had reached the heart of the house. The voice now spoke clearly, its words chilling him to the core. "You've come for something, Jack, but you will never leave. Not the same. You'll never leave at all." A door opened at the end of the hallway, and Jack, trembling, stepped toward it. He knew, without a doubt, that whatever was behind that door would change everything. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the door, his mind torn between the pull of the unknown and the instinct to turn back, to flee, to forget everything that had led him here. But he couldn't stop now. Something deep within him, something primal, urged him forward. The air felt thicker, as if the house itself was drawing breath, waiting, watching. He pushed the door open, its hinges screeching in protest. The room beyond was dimly lit by a single chandelier, its crystals flickering with a pale, unnatural glow. The furniture was ancient, draped in layers of dust and cobwebs, yet everything seemed perfectly intact, as if untouched by time. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with strange artifacts. Jars of pickled creatures, faded books with symbols Jack didn't recognize, and mirrors that seemed to reflect things that weren't there. At the center of the room stood a large, ornate chair, its velvet cushions dark with age. In front of it, a figure sat, its features obscured by shadow. The voice that had been echoing throughout the house now emanated from this figure, cold and distant. "Welcome," the figure said, its voice low, smooth, almost comforting, like the whisper of an old friend. "You've come for answers, haven't you, Jack? You've come for the one thing that has eluded you your whole life." Jack's throat tightened. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The words were lodged in his chest, stuck like thorns. The figure shifted in the chair, and Jack felt his eyes drawn to it against his will. As the shadows receded, the figure revealed itself. A woman, or what had once been a woman. Her skin was pale, stretched too tight over her bones, and her eyes gleamed with an otherworldly hunger. She smiled, but it was a smile that didn't belong to a human, a smile that only deepened the sense of wrongness in the room. "You think you are seeking redemption," the woman continued, her voice now tinged with something darker. "But the truth, Jack, is far more complicated than that. Redemption is a lie. It's nothing but a comforting illusion, a reason to keep breathing when you know deep down that you are already damned." Jack's pulse raced as her words sank into him. He hadn't realized how badly he had wanted to believe in redemption until now. He hadn't realized how much he had needed it. But now, here in this twisted place, the idea of redemption seemed like nothing more than a cruel joke. "Who are you?" Jack finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse. He wasn't sure if he wanted an answer, or if he was just trying to delay the inevitable. The woman's lips curled upward, her smile widening until it seemed too wide for her face, too unnatural. "I am the one who sees," she said softly. "The one who knows everything you've done, everything you've hidden. The one who can give you what you want most, if you're willing to pay the price." The room seemed to pulse with energy as her words resonated in the air. Jack's mind raced. What did she mean by pay the price? What kind of bargain was she offering? "You want to know why you're here, don't you?" the woman asked, her eyes gleaming with an unsettling understanding. "You've spent years running from your past, hiding from the things you've done. You thought you could outrun it, but you can't, Jack. You can't outrun the darkness inside you." Jack's breath caught in his throat. The memories, those dark, twisted memories of his past, flashed in front of his eyes. He could see them clearly now, the faces of the people he had hurt, the ones he had betrayed, the ones whose lives he had ruined. The guilt, the shame, the endless weight of it all. It had always been with him, lurking just below the surface, gnawing at him. "Let me show you," the woman said, her voice soft but insistent. "Let me show you what you've been running from." The room seemed to darken as her words took root, and Jack felt his body go rigid. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. His mind was gripped by a force he couldn't understand, a force that dragged him into the shadows of his past. The first memory hit him like a wave, sharp, brutal. He was standing in a dark alleyway, watching as a man, bloodied and bruised, begged for his life. Jack had been the one to do it, the one to put the man in that position. He remembered the rush, the power, the feeling of control. But now, looking back, it felt like a nightmare. His hands were stained with blood, and the faces of the people he had hurt seemed to close in on him, suffocating him. The next memory was worse. He was in a small, dimly lit room, the walls closing in around him. He could hear the pleading voices, feel the fear in the air, the way it clung to everything. He had been the cause of it all, the lies, the betrayal. He had promised to help, to protect, but in the end, he had only made it worse. The woman's laughter echoed in his ears, cruel and knowing. She reveled in his torment, in his suffering. She knew every mistake, every failure. She had seen it all. "Do you understand now, Jack?" she whispered. "Do you understand why you're here? Why you've always been drawn to this place?" Jack couldn't speak. He couldn't even think. The weight of his past, of all the choices he had made, crushed him. The memories were too much to bear. He wanted to scream, to escape, but there was no way out. The house had him, and it would never let him go. "You can make it stop, Jack," the woman said. "You can end it all. All you have to do is make a choice." Her words echoed in the chamber, like a promise and a curse. Jack didn't know what she meant, but he felt the urgency in her voice. He didn't know what kind of power she held, but he knew that whatever it was, it could give him what he wanted most: relief, redemption, freedom from the burden of his past. But at what cost? The woman leaned forward, her smile widening. "Do you want to escape, Jack? Do you want to forget all the pain, all the mistakes? Or are you willing to face it? Are you willing to accept who you really are?" Jack's head spun. He could feel the darkness closing in around him, the weight of his past pressing down on his chest. He was suffocating. "You have a choice, Jack," the woman said again, her voice sweet as honey. "But remember, every choice comes with a price. And once you make it, there is no turning back." Jack was on the verge of collapse. He felt his legs giving way beneath him, the weight of his decisions too much to bear. He could hear the voices in his head, the voices of the people he had wronged, the voices of his own conscience. The room seemed to spin, the walls closing in on him. And then he made his choice. Jack's breath came in ragged gasps, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. His hands trembled as they gripped the edges of the chair. The woman's eyes never left him, their cold gaze like a magnet, pulling him deeper into the web she had woven. "You've made your choice, haven't you?" she asked, her voice like velvet, smooth and manipulative. There was no sympathy, no understanding, just the sharp edge of inevitability. You want to escape. You want the pain to end. He nodded, barely able to speak. The weight of the memories, the ghosts of all that he had done, pressed down on him with unbearable force. His past had been a twisted trail of lies and cruelty, and every step forward had been built on the suffering of others. But now there was a chance to be free, a chance to sever the ties that bound him to his failures. Very well, the woman said, standing up slowly, the darkness in the room swirling around her like an inky mist. She extended a hand, pale and long-fingered, towards him. Take my hand, Jack, and all that you wish for will be yours. There was a moment of hesitation. The air seemed to thicken, suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to act. Jack could feel the pull of the woman's power, the allure of her offer. It was everything he had ever wanted, the release from the torment, the end of his endless self-loathing. But a flicker of doubt stirred deep within him, just below the surface. Was this truly a chance at redemption? Or was it another trap, another false promise luring him deeper into darkness? He glanced at the door, the faintest thought of escape crossing his mind. But the door was now sealed tight, the hallway outside nothing but shadows. There was no way back. I want it, Jack whispered, his voice thick with desperation. His hand shook as he reached out, brushing against hers. The instant his skin made contact with hers, the room seemed to collapse in on itself. A cold, numbing wave washed over him, as if the very essence of life had been drained from the air. His vision blurred, and he felt his body grow heavier, as if his soul itself was being sucked out of him, leaving only a hollow shell. The woman's grin widened, impossibly wide, stretching across her face, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. Her eyes, once gleaming with power, now looked like empty voids, devoid of all humanity. Did you really think it would be that easy? She purred. Did you think you could escape your past with a simple wish? The room spun wildly as Jack's heart began to race, his breath shallow and frantic. He tried to pull away, but it was too late. The woman's grip tightened around him, her fingers cold like iron. The shadows in the room seemed to twist, forming grotesque shapes, reaching out for him. I offered you escape, Jack, she whispered, her voice no longer sweet but venomous. But you are not the one to make the choice. You never were. He struggled, his body fighting against an invisible force that held him in place. His mind screamed for release, for an end to the agony. The shadows around him grew thicker, darker, until they consumed everything. The last vestiges of light flickered and died. When Jack awoke, he was lying on the floor of the room, the chair gone, the woman nowhere to be seen. The room was quiet, almost too quiet. His head throbbed as he tried to sit up, his muscles aching as if he had been contorted in unnatural positions for hours. The silence was oppressive. The air was thick with the smell of dampness and decay. Jack's heart pounded as he slowly pushed himself to his feet, his legs unsteady beneath him. Something had changed. Something was wrong. He turned, his eyes scanning the room. Everything was the same, and yet nothing was. The walls, the shelves, the mirrors, all seemed to pulsate with a strange, unsettling energy. The room itself felt alive, as if it were aware of his presence, watching him with malevolent intent. A low, guttural sound echoed from the corner of the room. Jack's eyes shot towards it, his breath catching in his throat. There, emerging from the darkness, were figures, shadows, but not shadows. They were vaguely human, their features twisted, distorted. Their eyes glowed with a sickly green light, and their mouths opened wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Jack stumbled backward, panic flooding his veins. He had seen them before, in his dreams, in his nightmares. These were the faces of the people he had wronged, the ones he had hurt. They were here, and they were angry. No, he whispered, shaking his head. No, this can't be happening. But the figures advanced, their limbs moving in jerky, unnatural motions, their eyes never leaving him. He could feel their presence closing in on him, suffocating him. "Jack," one of them hissed, its voice raspy and distorted, like a broken record. "You wanted escape, didn't you? You wanted redemption." Jack's breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This was his price. This was what he had paid for his wish. He hadn't escaped his past. He had only deepened his torment. The figures surrounded him, their grotesque faces contorted in expressions of rage and pain. They reached out for him, their hands cold and clammy, their touch like ice. "You can never escape what you've done, Jack," another figure croaked. "You can never outrun the darkness inside you." Jack tried to run, but his legs felt like lead. He stumbled, his feet tripping over each other as he tried to make it to the door. But the door was gone. The room was a prison, and he was trapped inside it, with the ghosts of his past closing in. The figures closed in on him, their whispers growing louder, filling his mind with their accusations. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. All that remained was the suffocating darkness, the relentless weight of his guilt, and the gnawing feeling that he had made the wrong choice. And then, just as he felt the cold hands close around his throat, the darkness swallowed him whole. The blackness that consumed Jack was suffocating, like drowning in a void that knew no end. There was no sound, no light, no escape, just endless, crushing pressure. For a moment, he thought he had died. But death, he quickly realized, was not what awaited him. His body felt weightless, as though he were drifting in some sort of dark limbo. Time had no meaning here. His thoughts swirled, fragmented and broken, torn apart by the haunting voices of those he had wronged, their accusations replaying in his mind like a cruel, endless loop. Each face, each name, flashed before him with unrelenting speed, their hatred and pain directed squarely at him. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the darkness lifted. Jack gasped, his lungs aching as he inhaled the musty air. His eyes snapped open, only to be met with an oppressive, gray sky overhead. He was no longer in the room. He was standing in the middle of a barren, windswept field, the ground beneath his feet cracked and dry. The land stretched out in every direction, devoid of life, its emptiness mirroring the hollow ache in his chest. The figures, the shadows were gone, but the weight of their presence lingered, a constant, gnawing reminder of what he had done. Jack's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his nails digging into the skin of his palms. His heart pounded in his chest, but there was no relief, only the crushing reality that this, whatever this was his new existence. As he looked around, trying to make sense of his surroundings, he saw something in the distance, an old, decaying building. It stood alone, broken and abandoned, a haunting silhouette against the oppressive sky. It was familiar, somehow, though Jack couldn't place why. Without thinking, he began to walk toward it. His legs moved mechanically, each step heavier than the last, as though the land itself resisted his movement. His thoughts were clouded, his mind still reeling from the events that had brought him here. What had happened? Had he truly made a deal with the devil, or was this just another layer of his punishment? As he approached the building, its details became clearer. It was an old house, long abandoned, its windows shattered, its door hanging off its hinges. The walls were covered in thick layers of grime and soot, the roof caving in at odd angles. It was a place of death, of decay. And yet, there was something familiar about it, something that felt like home. Jack hesitated at the threshold, his hand hovering over the door, his gut twisted with a deep, instinctual dread. He knew what he would find inside, or at least he thought he did. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open, its rusty hinges creaking in protest. The inside of the house was dark, the air thick with dust and decay. The walls seemed to close in on him, as though the house was alive, watching him, judging him. But it was the shadows that filled the room, shifting and writhing in unnatural ways, that truly made his blood run cold. Suddenly, a voice, low and guttural, whispered from the corner of the room. Jack spun around, his heart skipping a beat. "You should never have come back." The words sent a shock of fear through his body, but he could not tear his eyes away from the source of the voice. There, in the far corner of the room, stood a figure. It was cloaked in darkness, its face hidden in the shadows, but Jack could feel its presence, its power. It was the same voice that had spoken to him in the house, the same voice that had manipulated him into making the choice that had led him here. "You thought you could escape," the voice continued, its tone mocking, cruel. "You thought you could outrun the consequences of your actions. But you cannot. You cannot hide from yourself." Jack's heart raced, his mind a mess of conflicting emotions. He wanted to run, to escape, but he knew he couldn't. Not now. Not anymore. He had made his choice, and now he would face the consequences. "You wanted redemption," the voice said, its form beginning to shift, like smoke swirling in the air. "But you've only found more suffering, more torment. This is your fate, Jack, your punishment, and there is no escaping it." Jack opened his mouth to speak, to beg, to plead for mercy, but no words came out. His throat was dry, his voice stolen by the weight of the darkness around him. The figure in the corner stepped forward, its face emerging from the shadows. It was a twisted, horrific version of himself, a reflection of all the guilt, all the darkness that had festered inside him. Its eyes were empty, hollow, just like the ones he had seen in his nightmares. Its lips curled into a sinister smile, and it whispered, "You will never be free." Jack fell to his knees, the weight of the truth crashing down on him. There was no escape, no redemption, no hope. His past, his choices had bound him to this place, and he would never be able to outrun the consequences. The torment would never end. As the figure stepped closer, Jack felt the darkness consume him once again, his vision fading to black. The darkness that swallowed Jack felt heavier this time, as if the weight of the void was pressing him deeper into its grasp. But this time he wasn't floating aimlessly. He could feel the ground beneath him, cold, damp, and unforgiving stone. Slowly, awareness returned to him. His body ached, his head throbbed, and the sharp metallic scent of blood hung in the air. When he opened his eyes, Jack found himself in what looked like an ancient, decrepit hall. The walls were made of cracked stone, slick with moss and grime, and faint, otherworldly light flickered from torches mounted along the walls. The air was suffused with a chilling dampness, and the oppressive silence was broken only by the distant sound of dripping water. Ahead of him, a massive set of double doors loomed, carved from blackened wood and adorned with grotesque, swirling patterns that seemed to writhe when he looked too closely. They exuded a malevolent aura, as though whatever lay beyond was alive and waiting. "Jack," a voice hissed, echoing around the hall. He turned sharply, searching for the source, but there was nothing, only shadows that seemed to stretch and pulse unnaturally. The voice came again, this time from everywhere and nowhere. "You thought you could escape me." The voice sent shivers down his spine, but it was familiar, hauntingly so. It was his own voice, twisted and layered, as if spoken by something imitating him. "Come," it urged. "You're almost there." Against his better judgment, Jack found himself stepping forward. Each step felt like an eternity, his footsteps echoing loudly against the silence of the hall. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, and the closer he got to the doors, the heavier the air became. When he reached them, he hesitated. The carvings seemed to shift under his gaze, forming grotesque faces contorted in agony. One of them whispered, "Turn back." Another hissed, "It's too late." Ignoring them, Jack pushed against the doors, his hands trembling as the heavy wood groaned open. The space beyond was immense, a cavernous chamber that stretched infinitely in every direction, its ceiling lost in darkness. At its center was a massive, pulsating mass of shadow, a void given form. Tendrils of darkness extended from it, twisting and curling like smoke, and its surface shimmered with an otherworldly iridescence. Jack felt a pull, a magnetic force that drew him closer. The mass seemed alive, breathing, pulsating in rhythm with his own heartbeat. As he stepped into the chamber, the doors behind him slammed shut with a deafening boom. "Welcome," the shadow hissed. Its voice was layered, like 1,000 whispers speaking at once. "You've come far, Jack." Jack swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "What are you?" The shadow pulsed, and for a moment, Jack saw his own face reflected in its surface, distorted and twisted. "I am everything you fear, everything you desire. I am the consequences of your choices, Jack. And I am the one who holds the answers you seek." "You're the one who brought me here," Jack said, his voice trembling. "You're the one who showed me all of this." "I showed you the truth," the shadow corrected. "The truth of who you are, of what you are. And now you must decide." "Decide what?" Jack asked, his fists clenched. "What do you want from me?" The shadow's tendrils extended, encircling him but never touching. "Your fate is in your hands, Jack. You came seeking redemption. But redemption has a price." A tendril of darkness snaked toward him, stopping inches from his chest. From its tip emerged a small, black dagger, its blade glinting with a sinister light. "Take this," the shadow said. "Use it. Sacrifice the part of yourself that holds you back, the part that clings to guilt, to weakness. Only then can you be free." Jack stared at the dagger, his heart pounding. It seemed to radiate power, calling to him. But the voice of the shadow wasn't the only one he heard. Echoes of the people he had wronged whispered in his ears, their voices filled with pain and anger. "You think freedom comes from running away?" one voice hissed. "You think a clean slate erases what you've done? You don't deserve freedom," another spat. "You deserve this. All of this." Jack's hand hovered over the dagger. His mind raced. If he took it, if he used it, would he truly find peace? Or would he simply be trading one torment for another? The shadow seemed to sense his hesitation. "You cannot escape your past, Jack," it said, its voice soothing, almost comforting. "But you can control your future. Take the dagger. Free yourself." Jack's fingers closed around the hilt of the blade. It was cold, its surface slick and unyielding. As he lifted it, the voices in his head grew louder, a cacophony of pain and anger and regret. The weight of the dagger was immense, as though it carried the burden of every choice he had ever made. The shadow loomed closer, its form shifting and pulsing. "Make your choice, Jack. Sacrifice your guilt, or remain a prisoner of it forever." Jack raised the blade, his hand trembling. The chamber seemed to close in around him, the air thick with tension. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions: fear, anger, regret, and a desperate longing for peace. And then he made his choice. The dagger in Jack's hand seemed to hum, as if alive, its dark energy pulsing in time with his own heartbeat. He held it aloft, the point hovering just above his chest, where the shadow tendrils now coiled loosely, waiting, watching. The voices of the people he had wronged grew deafening, filling his mind with chaos, doubt, and recrimination. "It's all a lie," one of the voices snarled. "This shadow offers nothing but more chains." "No," another countered, pleading. "This is your chance, Jack. Don't waste it." The conflicting whispers clawed at his thoughts, driving him closer to the edge of madness. The shadow loomed closer, its tendrils forming a semicircle around him, hemming him in. Each movement it made seemed calculated, as though it were savoring the moment. "Do it," it urged, its voice honeyed with temptation. "Release the burden you carry, and you will find the strength to rise above it." Jack's grip tightened around the dagger. His arm trembled. Could he do it? Could he sever the part of himself that held all the pain, all the guilt, all the humanity he had left? Was that sacrifice worth whatever peace the shadow promised? In the chamber's oppressive silence, another voice rose above the clamor. Faint, but clear and resolute. It was his own voice, untainted and raw. "This isn't about freedom," it whispered. "This is about power. And power always demands more." Jack froze. The realization hit him like a thunderclap. The shadow didn't want to free him, it wanted to feed on him. The sacrifice wasn't about redemption or letting go of guilt. It was about submission, about surrendering the last shred of control he had over his life. He turned to face the shadow, lowering the dagger slowly. Its surface darkened, the shimmer dimming as if sensing his defiance. "No," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper, but firm. The shadow recoiled slightly, the tendrils quivering. "What did you say?" "I said no," Jack repeated, louder this time. "I'm not giving you what you want." The chamber seemed to shudder, the walls vibrating with a low, guttural growl. The shadow's form expanded, towering over him, its tendrils writhing angrily. "Foolish mortal," it hissed, the honeyed tone replaced by raw malice. "Do you think you can defy me? You came here seeking my power. You think you can leave without paying the price?" Jack gritted his teeth, his resolve hardening. "Maybe I can't leave, but I'm not giving you the satisfaction." With that, he hurled the dagger to the ground. The blade shattered on impact, releasing a burst of dark energy that rippled through the chamber. The shadow screamed, a sound that pierced through Jack's very soul, and the tendrils lashed out wildly, striking the walls and ceiling. Cracks spiderwebbed through the stone, chunks of debris raining down. The oppressive weight in the air lifted slightly, and for a moment Jack thought he might have gained the upper hand. But then the shadow coiled in on itself, its form condensing into a smaller, more concentrated mass. Its voice was quieter now, but sharper, more menacing. "You will regret this, Jack," it said. "You think you've won, but you've only sealed your fate. I am not bound by this place. Wherever you go, I will follow. Whatever you do, I will haunt you. There is no escape." The ground beneath Jack's feet began to crumble, and he stumbled backward, barely keeping his balance. The shadow surged forward, a wave of darkness that engulfed him. He felt its cold tendrils wrap around his body, squeezing, pulling, dragging him into the void. And then he was falling. When Jack opened his eyes, he was lying on the forest floor, the canopy of twisted, skeletal trees above him blotting out the sky. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the faint sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, distant animal cries, felt unnaturally muted. He pushed himself to his feet, every muscle in his body aching. The memory of the shadow's voice lingered in his mind, a persistent echo that refused to fade. "You think you can escape me?" it had said. "There is no escape." Jack glanced around, trying to get his bearings. The forest seemed endless, its paths winding and indistinguishable. But as he turned, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Carved into the bark of a nearby tree were the same grotesque symbols that had adorned the shadow's doors. They glowed faintly, pulsing with a sinister light. And they weren't just on one tree, they were everywhere, forming a network of eerie markings that spread as far as he could see. The shadow was right. It wasn't bound by the chamber. It was here in the forest, in the very air he breathed. And it was watching. Jack stumbled forward, his breath quickening. The faint glow of the symbols on the trees pulsed rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat. Alive, watching, mocking. Every step he took was shadowed by the sense of something unseen just behind him. Yet no matter how quickly he turned, there was nothing but darkness and the tangled forest. He could feel the shadow's presence, a chilling weight on his chest that seemed to deepen with each passing moment. It wasn't a question of if it would strike, but when. After what felt like hours of wandering, Jack emerged into a clearing. The oppressive trees gave way to an open expanse dominated by an ancient, crumbling structure. It looked like a church or what was left of one. The spire had long since fallen, and the walls were choked with creeping vines, their leaves black and glossy like spilled ink. The air here felt heavier, laden with an unnatural silence. Jack hesitated. His instincts screamed to turn back, but the glimmer of torchlight from within the ruined structure drew him in. Someone or something was inside. He wasn't alone. With each step toward the church, his surroundings seemed to warp. The forest grew darker, the trees closing in like silent sentinels. The air carried whispers now, soft, unintelligible, but insistent. His hand twitched toward his belt, where his knife sat, a meager comfort against whatever lay ahead. Inside the church, the torchlight flickered erratically, casting jagged shadows across the walls. As Jack approached the entrance, he saw the source of the light, a group of figures in dark robes standing in a circle. They chanted in low, guttural tones, their voices blending with the whispers that had plagued him in the forest. In the center of the circle lay a woman, bound and gagged, her eyes wide with terror. Symbols, identical to those on the trees, were carved into her bare arms, blood trickling down her skin. She writhed against her bonds, but the ropes held firm. Jack's chest tightened. He had seen his share of horrors in the world, but this was something else entirely. The robed figures didn't notice him, their focus consumed by their ritual. Jack crouched behind a broken pew, weighing his options. He could intervene, but against how many? 6? 7? He wasn't sure. And if they had the same connection to the shadow as the forest symbols did, he might be walking into a trap. But the woman's muffled screams pulled at him. He couldn't just leave her. Could he? A tendril of the shadow's voice slid into his mind. She's already lost. You'll accomplish nothing but your own destruction. Walk away. Jack shook his head, trying to block out the voice, but it persisted. They will kill you, Jack. They will make you suffer. For what? One life? How many have you already abandoned? One more makes no difference. His fingers brushed the hilt of his knife. He could almost hear his pulse thudding in his ears. He took a slow, deep breath, and then he moved. Jack sprang from his hiding place, his knife flashing in the dim torchlight. The first robed figure didn't even have time to scream before Jack's blade slit their throat. Blood sprayed across the stone floor, and the chanting stopped abruptly. The others turned, their faces hidden by deep hoods. One raised a hand, and Jack felt a wave of force slam into him, throwing him against the wall. Pain exploded through his back, and he barely managed to roll away as a second figure lunged at him with a rusted blade. Adrenaline surged, dulling the pain. Jack lashed out, catching the second attacker's wrist and driving his knife into their ribs. The figure let out a gurgling gasp before collapsing. The others moved quickly, their movements inhumanly fluid. Jack's mind raced. He was outnumbered and outmatched. The shadow's voice slithered back into his thoughts. Run, Jack. Leave her. Save yourself. No, he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. He ducked under another attack, his knife slicing through the fabric of a robe. He could see the woman now, her eyes locked on his, silently begging him to hurry. A robed figure began chanting again, and Jack felt the air grow thick. Shadows coalesced around the figure's hands, forming sharp, jagged shapes. Jack threw his knife, the blade spinning end over end before sinking into the figure's chest. The shadows dissipated, and the figure crumpled. By the time the fight ended, Jack was bloodied and gasping for breath. The robed figures lay dead around him, their bodies unnaturally still, as though life had been drained from them entirely. Jack staggered to the woman and cut her bonds. She sat up, coughing and rubbing her wrists, her eyes darting to the bodies around them. Who are you? She asked, her voice trembling. Someone who doesn't have time for questions, Jack said, pulling her to her feet. We need to. The floor beneath them shuddered, and a low growl reverberated through the church. Jack turned to see the bodies of the robed figures dissolving into dark, viscous liquid. The liquid pooled together, bubbling and churning, forming a massive, writhing mass of shadow. The shadow's voice boomed, filling the chamber. You cannot fight me, Jack. You cannot win. You only delay the inevitable. Jack gripped the woman's arm tightly, pulling her toward the exit. Move, he shouted. They ran, the shadow surging after them, its tendrils slithering across the floor and walls, tearing through the stone like paper. Jack and the woman burst from the crumbling church into the oppressive forest. The shadow surged behind them, its tendrils tearing through trees, reducing them to splinters. The symbols on the trees pulsed brighter, their glow casting eerie patterns on the forest floor. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony that seemed to come from the very air around them. They reached a clearing with a massive stone monolith in the center, its surface covered in the same glowing runes. Jack's instincts screamed that this was the source, the anchor that allowed the shadow to exist in the physical world. The woman stumbled to her knees, clutching her arms where the symbols had been carved into her skin. "You brought me here for a reason," she gasped, her voice trembling. "It needs me to finish the ritual, to break free." Jack turned to her, his mind racing. He could see it now, this wasn't about saving her. She was a vessel, a catalyst for whatever the shadow intended to do. The runes on her arms began glowing, resonating with the symbols on the monolith. The shadow reared back, towering over them like a living storm. "Kill her, Jack," the shadow hissed, its voice both seductive and terrifying. "End her life and I will spare you. Walk away. This is not your burden." The woman looked up at him, her eyes wide with terror and pleading. "Don't listen to it," she cried. "If you kill me, it wins. But if you don't," she didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what her words implied. She would die anyway, but the shadow might remain bound. Jack gritted his teeth. His knife felt impossibly heavy in his hand. Every fiber of his being screamed for a way out, a choice that didn't end in blood or failure. But there was none. The shadow lunged, its tendrils swarming toward Jack and the woman. Jack acted on instinct, shoving her behind him and raising his knife. The blade glinted in the faint light of the runes, and for a moment, the tendrils hesitated. "Stop running," the shadow growled, its voice a thunderous roar. "End her. Save yourself. That is your only escape." Jack's mind flashed with memories of his past. Every death he had caused, every decision that had led him to this moment. The weight of his guilt was suffocating. He had sought redemption, but now he realized there was no clean path to it. "I'm not afraid of you," Jack spat, gripping the knife tightly. The shadow paused, almost as if amused. "You should be." Jack turned to the woman, his voice low and strained. "I need you to run." "No," she cried. "If I leave, it'll..." "Run," Jack bellowed, shoving her toward the edge of the clearing. The woman hesitated, tears streaming down her face, but then she turned and ran. Jack faced the monolith, the runes glowing brighter as the shadow closed in. He knew what he had to do. Jack plunged the knife into the monolith. A deafening crack split the air, and the runes exploded with light. The shadow let out an unearthly scream, its form writhing and twisting as the light consumed it. The tendrils disintegrated, the darkness peeling away layer by layer. But the cost was immediate. The light from the runes surged into Jack, his body convulsing as the monolith drew on his life force. The ground beneath him trembled, the earth splitting open as the shadow was dragged back into the void it had come from. The woman stopped at the edge of the forest, turning to see Jack standing before the monolith, his body engulfed in light. "Jack!" she screamed, her voice breaking. Jack turned to her one last time, his face pale but resolute. "Go." Live, the light intensified, blinding and all-consuming. The woman shielded her eyes as the ground beneath the monolith collapsed, swallowing the structure, Jack, and the shadow in one final, cataclysmic roar. When the light faded, the forest was silent. The monolith was gone, replaced by a smoldering crater. The woman stood at the edge, staring into the void, tears streaming down her face. The oppressive weight of the shadow was gone, but so was Jack. She fell to her knees, clutching the knife he had left behind. The runes on her arms had faded, but their scars remained, a permanent reminder of what had transpired. In the distance, the forest began to regrow, the trees reclaiming the clearing as if nothing had happened. But the woman knew better. The shadow was gone, but the cost of its banishment would haunt her forever. And somewhere, in the deepest recesses of the void, the shadow whispered faintly, its presence not entirely erased. "Nothing stays buried forever." The fog wrapped around the car like a cold breath, clinging to the windows as Thomas drove deeper into the mountain range. He didn't know why he kept going. Maybe it was the pull of a promise made long ago, or perhaps the cryptic letters had pushed him too far, leading him to a place he couldn't undo. Belgrave. The town was a speck in the distance on the map, a forgotten name that most wouldn't even recognize, but its reputation had carved its mark into Thomas's conscience. It had been years since he last heard the name, years since he had fled from the consequences of his own failures. But something about the letters had brought it all back. They were simple, vague. A series of invitations, really, each one written by different hands but saying the same thing. You can't escape what's coming. Only Belgrave offers redemption, but be warned. Every wish carries a cost. He had dismissed them at first. People often wrote nonsense when they were desperate. But then the nightmares began. Dreams of his past, of people he had wronged, of lives destroyed by his inaction and neglect. And when he woke, the guilt was still there, gnawing at him, clawing at his very soul. It was after one of these dreams that Thomas finally packed his bags and left. He had no idea what to expect in Belgrave, but he couldn't go on carrying the weight of his actions. There had to be someone that could take it away. The road to Belgrave was narrow and winding, a dark ribbon of asphalt cutting through dense, oppressive woods. The air felt colder here, even in the late summer, and the silence was oppressive. There were no other cars, no signs of life. The woods seemed to close in around him, the trees standing like ancient sentinels, their gnarled branches twisting in unnatural directions. As Thomas neared the town, his pulse quickened. The fog thickened, and soon the outline of the town emerged. Nothing more than a shadow in the distance, shrouded in mist. The buildings were dilapidated, their windows shattered or boarded up. It felt like a place that time had abandoned, left to rot in its own sorrow. He slowed as he entered, scanning the empty streets. No one was out, not a single person in sight. Yet the town felt alive, in a way, as though it were watching him. Thomas felt eyes on him, from behind the boarded-up windows or from within the trees that loomed at the edges of the town. A shiver ran down his spine. The first building he came across was the inn, a small, crooked structure that appeared as if it had been standing for centuries. It was the only place that looked remotely inhabited, so he pulled into the dirt lot and parked. As he stepped out of the car, the air felt even colder, the fog seeping under his skin. The door creaked open before he could knock. A figure stood in the doorway, a man gaunt and thin, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his movements were slow and deliberate, as though every action took an enormous effort. "You've come," the man rasped, his voice rough like gravel. I wondered when someone would. Thomas didn't know how to respond, but the man didn't wait for an answer. He stepped aside, gesturing for Thomas to enter. The interior of the inn was dimly lit, with a smell of mildew and decayed wood permeating the air. The man didn't say another word but led him to a small, windowless room at the back of the building. The room was bare except for an old chair, a small table, and a thin cot. There was no warmth here, no comfort, only the weight of silence pressing down on him. "Why are you here?" the man asked after a long pause, his eyes fixed on Thomas. "What is it you seek from Belgrave?" Thomas hesitated. The letter, the warning, all of it swirled in his mind, but his mouth felt dry, as though his words would betray him. Finally, he spoke. "I came because I need to make things right. I've done terrible things, and I want to change. I've heard that something in Belgrave can give me a chance." The man's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. "Everyone who comes here believes they can fix what they've broken. But what you want isn't so simple. It never is. I don't care about the cost. I'll do whatever it takes," Thomas said, his voice more forceful than he intended. The man's smile faded, and his eyes seemed to grow darker. "Then you'll have to speak with the Hollow. It's where all things lost and broken come to find their price." Thomas frowned. "The Hollow?" The man nodded gravely. "Yes, but it's not a place you can simply walk to. You'll need to prove yourself first. The Hollow doesn't speak to just anyone. There are tests, trials. They'll challenge your very soul." Thomas's heart pounded. The weight of his past loomed over him, but the promise of redemption pulled at him, sharper than any knife. "I'll do it." The man's expression softened, though his eyes remained distant. "Very well. Go to the edge of the woods tonight. when the moon is at its highest. Stand there and wait. The hollow will come for you. Night had settled over Belgrave, thick and oppressive. The fog had not lifted. If anything, it had deepened, swallowing the town whole. Thomas stood at the edge of the woods, the path leading into the trees barely visible through the haze. He could hear the distant sound of something shifting within the underbrush, but when he turned to look, all he saw were shadows, stretching unnaturally in the pale moonlight. His breath came out in shallow gasps as he stood still, waiting. The trees loomed like dark sentinels around him, and for the first time he felt truly alone. There was no sound of life, no birds calling or insects buzzing. It was as if the world had gone still, holding its breath. The man at the inn had warned him. The hollow was not a place, but something more. A force, a presence. It didn't appear when you called for it, but when it decided you were ready. Thomas wasn't sure what that meant, but he had no choice. He had to see this through. His mind wandered back to the things he had done, the people he had hurt, the lives he had shattered. There was no way to undo it, no way to take back the cruelty, the carelessness. He had thought that running would make it all go away, but now, standing here in this forsaken town, he knew it was impossible. There was no escaping his sins. Not truly. A rustling sound broke through his thoughts, followed by a whisper, so faint that it was almost imperceptible. He turned, searching the darkness. The trees parted slightly, and in the distance, a figure emerged. It was a woman, tall and shrouded in a cloak of darkness, the fabric moving like smoke around her. Her face was hidden, but her presence seemed to command the very air, bending it around her. She moved with unnatural grace, as though the ground beneath her feet didn't quite touch her. Thomas felt his heart race, but he didn't run. He couldn't. He was frozen in place, drawn to her in a way he couldn't explain. The woman stopped a few feet away, her presence filling the space around him. "You've come," she said, her voice both soft and commanding, as if it was carried on the very wind. "I've been waiting. Are you the hollow?" Thomas asked, his voice shaking. The woman laughed, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the trees like a distant echo. "No, I am its messenger. The hollow is not a thing, but an essence, a force that resides in all things. It watches, listens, and chooses those worthy enough to call upon it." Thomas swallowed hard. "I've made terrible mistakes. I need to make them right." The woman tilted her head, as if considering him. "And what are you willing to sacrifice to atone for your sins?" The hollow does not give without taking. His chest tightened. He had no illusions about the cost. He had heard the stories. People who came to the hollow for redemption didn't leave the same. They never left whole. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth. The woman's eyes, if they could be called eyes, for they seemed to be pools of darkness, focused on him. She stepped closer, her presence nearly overwhelming. "Then follow me," she whispered. She turned and began walking into the woods, her footsteps soundless. Thomas hesitated, his every instinct screaming at him to turn back, but he knew that there was no other choice. He had come this far. He had to face whatever was ahead. The path twisted deeper into the forest, where the trees seemed to grow closer together, their gnarled branches weaving into an almost impenetrable canopy. The air grew colder still, and the fog thickened, curling around them like a living thing. After what felt like hours, they came upon a clearing. In the center, there was an ancient stone altar, worn by time and the elements. The woman stopped beside it, her cloak swirling around her like smoke. "Place your hands on the stone," she instructed. "The hollow will speak to you then." Thomas did as she asked, his hands trembling as he touched the stone. It was smooth and cold, as though it had absorbed the chill of centuries. The moment his skin made contact, he felt a jolt of energy surge through him, sharp and painful. It was as if the very earth itself was alive, pulsing beneath his fingers. And then the voice came. It wasn't a voice in the traditional sense. It didn't speak with words. It spoke directly into his mind, its presence both overwhelming and suffocating. "What is it you seek, Thomas?" The voice was like 100 whispers, blending together in a cacophony that made his skin crawl. He didn't know how to respond at first. What was he really asking for? Redemption? Forgiveness? Could he even hope for such things? I want to be free of my past, he said, his voice barely a whisper, barely even his own. I want to undo the wrongs I've done. The whispers swirled around him, pressing in on all sides, and the air seemed to grow colder still. For a moment, he felt as if he were drowning, the weight of his own sins sinking him deeper and deeper into the void. You wish to erase the pain, but the pain is what makes you whole, the voice responded. To sever the past is to sever yourself. What will you give in return? Thomas felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. His heart hammered in his chest. What would he give? He had nothing left, nothing of value. His soul, his life. I will give whatever it takes, he said, his voice rising in desperation. The ground beneath him trembled, and the woman's shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally, looming over him. The voice responded once more, its tone heavier now, as though it had been waiting for this moment. Very well. Suddenly, the ground beneath him gave way, and he was falling, plunging into a darkness so complete that it suffocated him. There was no air, no light, only the crushing weight of something vast and ancient pressing against him from all sides. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. He was lying on the ground, his body aching as though it had been torn apart and put back together. The woman was gone, and the clearing was silent once more. But something was different. The air no longer felt cold, felt wrong. He stood up, his legs unsteady. A single thought echoed through his mind. The price had been paid. But what exactly had he lost? The forest around him had transformed. The once oppressive stillness had faded, replaced by an unsettling hum that seemed to vibrate through the very earth beneath his feet. The trees stood tall but unfamiliar, their twisted limbs reaching toward the sky in unnatural angles. The fog, once dense and suffocating, had receded, but the air felt thick with something unspeakable, something waiting. Thomas blinked and looked around, trying to gather his bearings, but the clearing had shifted. The altar, once a stone relic of ancient rituals, was gone. In its place stood a darkened pool of water, its surface perfectly still, reflecting nothing but the dense night above. The water was black, as if it held the weight of all the sins in the world, and yet it seemed to call to him an invitation or a warning. He wasn't sure which. He stumbled toward it, his breath shallow, unsure of what he was supposed to do. Had the hollow granted his wish? Was this redemption, or had he simply traded one darkness for another? Look into it, a voice whispered, soft as the wind but clear as day. It was not the woman's voice, nor the hollow's. It was something else, something human. He turned quickly, but there was no one there. Only the water, staring back at him with a silence so profound it pressed into his skull. But he did as the voice suggested. The moment his gaze met the black surface of the pool, the world around him blurred. The trees seemed to twist and bend, their shadows stretching unnaturally toward him, and the ground beneath his feet shifted like sand. The water rippled, disturbing the stillness and the reflections it held. His reflection began to change. At first, it was a simple distortion, like the water was reacting to the movement of his own eyes. But then the figure in the water began to speak. It wasn't his voice. It was distorted, layered, as though more than one being had found its way into his image. You think you've paid the price? The voice mocked him. You think you've given enough? Thomas recoiled, stumbling back, but his feet wouldn't move fast enough. The reflection in the water was shifting faster now. The eyes, his eyes, glowing with an unnatural light. You can't undo the past, Thomas. Not this time. Not ever. He pressed his hands against his ears, trying to block out the voice, but it only grew louder, more insistent. He looked at his hands. His skin was pale, unnaturally so, and the veins underneath seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The same energy that had surged through him when he touched the stone. It wasn't gone. It was still there, feeding off his fear. The figure in the water began to speak again, this time with a sharp, guttural tone, as though something monstrous was trying to break free. "You've sacrificed everything, Thomas. But what if you were never meant to be redeemed? What if you've always been the monster?" His heart hammered in his chest as his reflection twisted into something monstrous. His features warped, his face growing elongated, his skin darkening and cracking like old stone. His hands, once human, became gnarled and twisted, the nails lengthening into claws. The vision was too much to bear. Thomas turned away, gasping for air, his mind swirling in confusion and terror. He couldn't think. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees pushing forward as if they were alive, shaking with malicious energy. A laugh, low, cruel, and full of mocking joy, echoed around him. The woman appeared again, stepping from the shadows as though she had always been there, watching. Her cloak billowed, and her presence filled the air, suffocating him. "Did you really think the hollow could give you what you sought?" she asked, her voice heavy with amusement. "It doesn't grant wishes, Thomas. It forces you to confront what you are. You can't escape who you've been." Thomas's knees buckled beneath him, and he sank to the ground. He wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but the words wouldn't come. The weight of his sins pressed down on him harder than ever. He had hoped for peace. He had hoped to somehow outrun his past. But the hollow had shown him a truth he couldn't ignore. Redemption wasn't just impossible. It wasn't even an option. "What happens now?" Thomas whispered, his voice breaking. The woman bent down, her face now visible, though it was nothing like human. Her eyes were wide, black pits, empty and hollow, and her smile stretched unnaturally across her face, as if her skin could barely contain it. "Now," she said softly, "you face the cost of your sins. You are no longer human. You never were. You're nothing but a shadow now, and this forest. This place is where shadows come to die." Thomas felt the ground beneath him give way once again, but this time there was no fall. He was suspended, as though his very soul had been detached from his body. His body, twisted and unnatural, no longer felt like his own. He could feel it withering, losing its humanity piece by piece. "You can never leave here," the woman's voice whispered as she vanished into the shadows. "Not now, not ever." The trees around him creaked and groaned as though they were alive, the very ground beneath his feet shifting like it had a mind of its own. He tried to move, but his limbs were heavy, sluggish. There was no escape from this place. The hollow had claimed him, not as a soul to be redeemed, but as one to be consumed. And as he fell into the darkness, his last thought was not of fear or regret. It was of how it had all started. The sins he thought he could outrun, the wish he thought could save him. But there was no salvation, only the hollow waiting, always waiting. Thomas felt as though the very essence of his being was being twisted and contorted, pulled from every direction by an unseen force. His limbs no longer obeyed him, and his senses were warped. His vision clouded with a darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. He was neither dead nor alive, floating in an endless void that felt like an eternity. Yet he could still hear the haunting whispers, the laughter that echoed through the shadows, gnawing at the edges of his mind. The air was thick with something foul, decay, rot, something ancient, and somewhere, deep in the void, he could sense the presence of something vast, something waiting. "Is this my punishment?" he murmured, his voice barely audible, lost in the suffocating darkness. There was no answer, only the silence, a silence that threatened to swallow him whole. But then, a soft light flickered in the distance, weak but persistent, like a star in an endless night. It pulled him toward it, a faint glimmer of hope in a sea of despair. For a moment, he thought it was the light of salvation, the thing he had been searching for all along. As he moved closer, his surroundings began to distort again. The shadows twisted, morphing into grotesque shapes, figures that seemed familiar, yet not quite. They were people, but not. Their faces were too blurred to recognize, their movements jerky and unnatural, as if they existed only in fragments of memory. And as they moved toward him, they reached out, their arms extending as though they wanted to touch him, to claim him. "Thomas," a voice rasped from one of the figures, a whisper so cold it sent a shiver down his spine. He recoiled instinctively, but the figure stepped closer, its face now clear. It was a woman, a stranger, though her eyes were familiar, hauntingly so. He recognized the eyes. He recognized the pain in them. It was his mother, but she was wrong. She couldn't be here. "Mother," he croaked, his voice barely a whisper. Her eyes, once full of life, were now empty, hollow, a void that mirrored the darkness around him. "You never should have come," she said, her voice echoing in the space around them. Her face twisted into something grotesque, something that resembled a smile but was too cruel, too wrong to be anything but a mockery. "Please," Thomas begged, trying to move but finding himself unable to break free of the pull. I wanted to change. I wanted to make things right." Her smile only widened, her lips peeling back to reveal teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. "You can't change the past, Thomas. You can't undo what you've done. You can't outrun what you are." She reached out, her fingers long and cold, and touched his chest. The moment her hand made contact, his body erupted with pain. It wasn't physical. It was something deeper, something more profound. He felt it in his soul, in his very core. The weight of every mistake he had ever made, every person he had betrayed, every life he had ruined, came crashing down on him all at once. The pain was unbearable. It suffocated him. "Why?" he gasped, choking on the darkness. "Why can't I change?" "Because you've already paid the price," she whispered, her voice now dripping with venom. "And it's never enough." The darkness around him seemed to grow stronger. The figures closed in on him, their distorted faces now nothing more than empty vessels, their voices blending into a chorus of regret, guilt, and despair. They screamed at him in a language he couldn't understand, their accusations and condemnations cutting through him like 1,000 knives. As they reached for him, pulling him deeper into the abyss, he realized there was no escape, no redemption, no hope. The Hollow had never been about offering a chance for salvation. It had always been a prison, a place where lost souls were kept to rot, to wither, to fade into nothingness. The wish, the desire for redemption, it had all been a lie. And now Thomas understood. He had traded his soul for nothing. And the cost, the true cost, was far greater than he had ever imagined. The light, the small glimmer of hope he had seen, faded into the distance, swallowed by the encroaching darkness. His mother's form disintegrated, replaced by the inhuman shapes of the creatures who had once been the people of the town. They were everywhere now, surrounding him, their eyes empty and accusing, their voices lost in the ever-growing chorus of suffering. Thomas couldn't scream. He couldn't even move. He was nothing now, nothing but a shadow among shadows. The Hollow had claimed him, and in the end, there was no redemption, only the never-ending emptiness of its embrace. The darkness was no longer oppressive. It was not simply the absence of light. It had become a presence of its own, alive, suffocating, yet strangely calming. Thomas's senses, dulled by the sheer force of the Hollow, were beginning to numb. He no longer felt the physical pain, but there was something worse, an emotional void, a hollowness deep within him that stretched infinitely, as though the very nature of his existence had been consumed by this place. He had stopped struggling. There was nothing left to fight. But then, amidst the encroaching void, a figure appeared. It wasn't like the others, shapeless, grotesque, twisted. This one had form, a silhouette standing in sharp contrast to the surrounding blackness. It was a man, tall and imposing, his features hidden in shadows, his presence magnetic. Even in this endless sea of despair, Thomas could feel a sense of something, authority, power, radiating from him. "Thomas," the man said, his voice deep and echoing, as though it reverberated through the very walls of the Hollow itself. Thomas's eyes widened. He couldn't place it, but something about this figure felt familiar. a remnant from his past, or a creation of the hollow. It didn't matter. He didn't care anymore. "Who are you?" Thomas rasped, his voice hoarse, a mere whisper against the silence. He wasn't even sure if he truly wanted to know. The man smiled, though it was a smile that never reached his eyes. "A guide, a fellow traveler, if you will. Though unlike you, I have chosen this path. And I have no intention of leaving." Thomas's mind churned with the words. A guide? A fellow traveler? He couldn't understand. He could barely grasp the concept of what he was even experiencing right now. "Why are you here?" Thomas asked, struggling to form the question through his confusion. The man's smile grew wider. He stepped closer, his movements deliberate and slow, as though savoring the moment. "You've been searching for redemption. That's why you came here, isn't it? To fix what you've broken, to undo what cannot be undone." He paused, as though testing the weight of his words. "But redemption is an illusion. Do you really think you deserve it? After all you've done?" Thomas's heart thudded painfully in his chest. The words stung, but they also felt oddly familiar. He had heard this before, hadn't he? That whisper in the dark, that voice that haunted him, the voice that questioned his every move. But now, here in the hollow, it was different. It was sharper, clearer. It wasn't a distant accusation. It was a direct challenge. Thomas swallowed, his throat dry. "I never meant for things to end up like this. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I thought I could fix it." The man let out a low, almost pitying chuckle. "You really believe that? After everything?" "No, Thomas. You've made your choices. And now, like all who come here, you'll face the consequences." Thomas recoiled, but the hollow seemed to tighten around him, holding him in place, trapping him in a cage of his own making. The man stepped closer, his presence growing heavier with each movement, like the weight of an unspoken truth. "Do you know why you're here? Do you know why the hollow called you?" Thomas's mind was racing. He didn't have the answers. He never had the answers. All he knew was that this place, this godforsaken town, had drawn him in, had fed him with lies wrapped in promises of salvation. Thomas trailed off, the words stuck in his throat. "Because you're weak," the man finished for him. "Because you're nothing but a pawn in a game that's much older than you. The hollow has no need for redemption. It thrives on suffering, on the agony of those who seek what they can never have. And you, Thomas, are one of its many victims." Thomas's chest tightened as the full weight of the man's words settled into his bones. A pawn. That's all he was. He had thought he could change, thought he could make things right. But it was too late. He was already tangled in the web, a part of the hollow's unyielding grip. The man's voice softened, almost like a whisper now, as he leaned closer. "I can offer you something if you want it. A choice, Thomas. A chance to escape this place. But you must understand the price. Nothing comes without cost. And this cost is something you will have to live with forever." Thomas's pulse quickened. He could feel the urgency in the man's voice, the weight of his words. A choice, a chance to escape. It sounded impossible, too good to be true. But then again, hadn't everything about this place been an illusion? What was real? And if the hollow was feeding on his suffering, what was the point of struggling anymore? "Escape," Thomas repeated, his voice trembling. "What do I have to do?" The man's eyes gleamed with something dark, something almost sadistic. "Nothing you haven't already done. All you have to do is make a choice. A simple one. All you need to do is let go." Thomas blinked, confused. "Let go." The man nodded. "Let go of everything. Your regrets, your guilt, your pain, your need for redemption. All of it. Only then can you leave this place." The words settled into Thomas's mind like poison. Let go. Could he? After everything he had been through, could he truly release himself from it all? From the guilt that gnawed at him? From the memories of those he had hurt? "No," Thomas whispered, his voice weak. I can't just let it all go. I want to change. I want to make it right." The man's smile faltered. "You think you have that choice? You think the hollow cares about your redemption?" "It doesn't, Thomas. It only wants your suffering. It wants you to break, to let go. That's the price. And if you refuse, you'll stay here forever, caught in an endless cycle of your own damnation. The man's form began to flicker, his edges blurring, as though he were fading into the very darkness that surrounded them. Make your choice, Thomas. Let go and you can escape, or hold on, and remain here. With that, the figure vanished, leaving Thomas alone in the dark. The hollow was silent once more, but in the silence, Thomas could still feel it. The presence, the weight of the choice he had to make. Would he let go and accept the consequences? Or would he cling to his past, to his guilt, and remain trapped forever? The choice was his, but the weight of it, the unbearable weight, felt like it would crush him before he could even decide. The darkness pressed in around Thomas like a suffocating shroud, its weight pulling at the very core of his being. The figure, the guide, or whatever he had been, was gone, but his words lingered in the air, reverberating in Thomas's mind like an echo that refused to fade. Let go of everything. The guilt, the regret, the ache of all the wrongs he had committed. Could he truly sever the ties that bound him to his past, to the torment that had followed him into this forsaken place? He clenched his fists, his nails digging into the palms of his hands. His body trembled, not from the cold, but from the intensity of the decision that lay before him. Let go. The hollow had promised escape if he did, but at what cost? Could he truly erase everything he had done, every life he had touched, for better or worse? No, it wasn't that simple. The images flooded his mind unbidden. Faces, the ones he had hurt, the ones he had abandoned. His sister, her last words echoing in his ears, the look of betrayal in her eyes. His father's disappointed gaze. The people in the town he had failed. He had done terrible things in his life, things he could never undo. Could he truly let all of it go and simply walk away? What kind of person would he become if he did? But the hollow was not a place for mercy, for second chances. It was a place of torment. And yet, somewhere deep within him, a voice whispered, a dark, tempting voice, that perhaps there was peace in surrender, perhaps in giving up the pain, in letting go of all the weight of the past. There would be nothing left to haunt him, nothing left to hurt him. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the rising tide of thoughts, the memories that clawed at him relentless. There was no escape from them. No matter how hard he tried to outrun them, they always followed, a shadow on his soul. A flash of movement caught his attention, something shifting in the periphery of his vision. When he turned his head, the figure appeared again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the same man, the guide, but a woman pale and cold, with eyes as dark as the void around them. Her face was twisted in pain, a silent scream frozen on her lips. She hovered in the dark, her body flickering in and out of focus like a broken mirror. Thomas, her voice came, though her lips didn't move. It was a whisper, but it was everywhere, echoing in his mind, filling the space like an insistent, cruel melody. You think you can escape it? You think you can outrun what you've done? Thomas took a step back, instinctively, his heart thundering in his chest. What are you? He whispered, though he wasn't sure if the question was for her or for himself. He didn't want to know. He didn't want any more torment. The woman's eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. I am what you've made me, she said, her voice soft and mocking. I am the consequence. The price. Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. What price? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. She stepped forward, and in the fleeting moment before her presence became overwhelming, she gave him a bitter smile. You don't remember, do you? But I do. I remember all of it. Every moment. The air grew heavier, the space pressing in on him as though the walls of the hollow were closing in. His chest tightened, the weight of the woman's presence suffocating. Let me show you, she murmured, and then everything snapped. The ground beneath his feet shattered like glass, and Thomas was falling. No, he wasn't falling. He was being pulled. A darkness surrounded him, a crushing void that swallowed him whole. Then, suddenly, he was no longer in the hollow. He was back in the town he had left behind, the one that had become a prison of its own. He stood at the edge of the street, but it was empty, not a single person in sight. Only the wind howled through the deserted streets, carrying with it the faint smell of decay. His eyes scanned the familiar buildings, the old, crumbling structures that had once been full of life. But now they stood silent, abandoned. The woman's voice echoed again, colder now, sharper. "Do you remember this place, Thomas? Do you remember what you did?" He turned. She stood at the far end of the street, her figure silhouetted against the moonlight, but her eyes were the only things that remained clear, black, empty. Thomas's stomach twisted. His breath caught in his throat. He could hear it now. Footsteps, not just his own, others. He turned again and his body froze. There, standing in the doorway of a broken building, was the figure of a child. A little girl, her face pale, her expression vacant. It was Alice, his sister. "Alice," Thomas whispered, his voice trembling. But Alice didn't respond. Instead, she tilted her head, a twisted smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Then she began to speak, but the words came out wrong, distorted, garbled, like they had been torn apart and sewn back together. "Why? Did you leave me?" she asked, her voice thin and broken. "Alice, Thomas's words faltered. His chest tightened, and he found it hard to breathe. "I needed you, Thomas." Her voice echoed around him, louder now. "I needed you, and you left." Thomas's legs began to move of their own accord. He didn't want to walk towards her, but his body was compelled, his steps dragging him closer to her like a puppet on strings. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though the words felt empty. "I didn't mean to. I never meant to leave you." But Alice didn't hear him. Or maybe she did. Maybe she was beyond hearing now. She reached out, her hand pale and skeletal. And in that moment, Thomas realized the truth, the price he had paid. The town wasn't empty because of some random calamity. It was empty because of him, his choices, his abandonment. Alice's smile twisted into something horrific. "You left me to die, and now you'll never escape." Before Thomas could react, her hand was on him, cold, icy, and in that instant, everything he had done, every mistake he had made, came crashing down on him. The guilt, the shame, the unbearable weight of the consequences, all piled on top of him. And then, everything was still. The silence that followed was unbearable, like the calm before an inevitable storm. Thomas stood there, frozen in the grip of his sister's touch, unable to move, unable to breathe. The world around him seemed to distort, as though it were stretching and pulling, unraveling at the seams. But all he could focus on were Alice's eyes, black and endless, the void within them threatening to swallow him whole. "Why did you leave me, Thomas?" Her voice was a low whisper, a haunting, insistent echo that bounced off the walls of his mind. "Why did you let me suffer alone?" He wanted to answer. He wanted to say something, anything to explain himself, to make her understand. But no words came. The guilt was too overwhelming, a tidal wave of regret crashing over him, drowning out his thoughts. He had left her. He had abandoned her when she needed him most. And in the end, she had paid the price for his neglect. Her hand tightened around his wrist, her fingers cold and unyielding, and the pain that coursed through him was not physical but something far deeper, something rooted in the very marrow of his soul. "I tried, Alice," he finally managed to say, his voice trembling. "I tried to come back. I didn't mean to." The words faltered, dying in his throat as Alice's twisted smile grew wider, her features warping, becoming more grotesque with each passing moment. She wasn't his sister anymore. She was something else entirely, something broken, something beyond saving. "You didn't try hard enough," she hissed, her voice now sharp and venomous. "You never do." Thomas stumbled back, trying to break free from her grasp, but his legs felt like lead. The town around him began to shift, its crumbling buildings warping into monstrous shapes, twisting and contorting in ways that defied reality. The wind howled louder, a cacophony of whispers filling the air, each one carrying the voices of the lost, of the people he had failed. The darkness around him deepened, and suddenly, the ground beneath his feet gave way. He fell once more, the cold void swallowing him, pulling him down into an endless abyss. The scream that tore from his throat was swallowed by the darkness, unheard, unacknowledged. When Thomas's eyes finally opened again, he found himself standing at the edge of the town. Only this time, it wasn't the town he remembered. It was different, distorted, a reflection of the place he had once known, but twisted beyond recognition. The buildings loomed tall, their windows dark and empty. The streets stretched out before him like a labyrinth, filled with shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. And there, at the center of the town, was the hollow. It loomed like a blackened, gaping wound in the world, its surface slick and reflective, as though it were a mirror to some deeper, darker part of his soul. Thomas could feel it, feel the weight of its presence, the way it seemed to beckon to him, urging him forward. But as he took a step closer, a voice echoed from the shadows, a voice that chilled him to his core. "You cannot escape, Thomas." He froze. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was the guide, the same man who had led him through the hollow before, but now his form was a blur, his shape flickering like a broken flame. "Why are you here?" Thomas demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. "What do you want from me?" The guide's form solidified, and the twisted, hollow smile that stretched across his face was unsettling. "What do you think I want? You've been given a choice, Thomas. A choice that no one can truly make. Let go or suffer the consequences." Thomas's heart pounded in his chest, and he took another step forward. He couldn't stand this place, couldn't stand the crushing weight of his past bearing down on him from every direction. He needed to end it. He needed to let go, as the hollow had promised. But as he drew closer to the gaping wound in the world, something inside him screamed to stop. "You think you can undo what you've done?" The guide's voice grew colder, sharper. "You think you can erase the past? You are not free. Not here. Not anywhere." Thomas stopped, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he stared into the blackened mirror of the hollow. His reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't the man he had known. It wasn't the man he was trying to become. No, it was the man he had been, the man who had made all those terrible choices, the man who had caused so much pain. His face was twisted with regret, eyes hollow, cheeks gaunt. The hollow wasn't offering redemption. It wasn't offering peace. It was offering something far more insidious, a chance to confront himself. "You can never escape who you are," the guide whispered, his voice filled with a cruel finality. "Not in this world. Not in any world." The mirror-like surface of the hollow rippled, and Thomas found himself standing at the edge of a cliff, looking out over the town he had abandoned. Below, the twisted, broken bodies of the people he had hurt lay sprawled across the streets. Alice, his father, the others, they were all there, trapped in the same cycle of suffering, forever doomed to live in the reflection of his actions. And then, a soft voice, no, a whisper, floated through the air, barely audible over the howling wind. "Why did you leave me, Thomas?" It was Alice again. Her voice was weak, hollow, filled with a sorrow that seemed to seep into his bones. "I'm sorry," he whispered, tears welling in his eyes. "I didn't mean to. I didn't..." But the words fell flat, swallowed by the void. There was no forgiveness here, no redemption, no escape, only the endless reflection of his own guilt, stretching into eternity. The air thickened as Thomas stood before the hollow, feeling the weight of every decision he had ever made pressing down on him like an unbearable burden. The world around him trembled, as though the very fabric of reality was about to snap. The whispers of the lost souls grew louder, drowning out his thoughts, their voices a cacophony of rage and sorrow, accusing him, condemning him. "You can't undo it." The guide's voice slithered through the chaos, cold and final. "There's no redemption here. There's no coming back. Thomas's mind raced, each step forward heavier than the last. He was trapped in a nightmare, a reflection of his worst fears, his darkest regrets. The hollow was not a place for forgiveness. It was a place for reckoning, and it demanded payment. You've seen the truth, the guide continued, its form flickering like a dying flame. You know what you did. You know what you failed to do. You are not innocent. You never were. The hollow pulsed, its surface shimmering as if it were alive, its reflections shifting like the ghosts of his past. Alice's face appeared in the mirror once more, her eyes dark, filled with an emptiness that echoed his own despair. Do you want to save yourself? The guide's voice whispered, filled with malice. Do you think that you deserve to? Thomas's heart raced. The question lingered in the air, a cruel temptation. What was he really seeking? Forgiveness? Redemption? Or was it just an escape from the suffocating weight of his guilt? No, Thomas said, his voice shaking. I don't deserve anything, but I can't stay here. The guide's laugh echoed, hollow and cruel. You can't leave, Thomas. You never could. Thomas's pulse quickened as the hollow's surface began to distort, swirling in on itself like a black hole, pulling everything toward its center. The reflections of the people he had failed twisted, distorting into grotesque, inhuman shapes, their faces contorted in pain and fury. Look at them, the guide sneered, gesturing toward the reflections. You're victims, you're failures. Do you think you can walk away from this? Do you think you can run from who you are? Thomas trembled, his vision swimming. His eyes darted from the twisted figures to the reflection of himself, his face staring back, no longer recognizable, consumed by his own darkness. He wanted to turn away. He wanted to scream, to beg for an escape. But there was no escape. Not here. Not from this. You've made your choice, the guide's voice intoned, its presence looming over Thomas like an oppressive weight. There's only one way out. But know this, Thomas. Whatever choice you make, there is no going back. The ground beneath his feet began to crumble, and for a brief moment, Thomas felt his body lifting, suspended between the terrifying black void of the hollow and the crumbling world around him. The choice was his. Please, Thomas whispered, his voice breaking. Please, I want to end this. I want to make it right. The guide's eyes gleamed with a cruel satisfaction. You can't make it right, but you can choose how it ends. And then, a figure emerged from the darkness. The faint outline of a woman, her face obscured by shadows. Her presence was cold, like a grave, and her very being seemed to radiate a sense of finality. It was Alice, but she was not the Alice he had known. She was something far worse, something born of his own guilt and torment. Her eyes were hollow, black as the night, her mouth twisted in a grotesque smile. She reached out, her hand cold and unyielding, and Thomas felt an overwhelming compulsion to reach for it. No, he whispered, backing away, his body trembling. No, I can't. But Alice's voice, soft and insistent, filled his mind, drowning out everything else. Take my hand, Thomas, she whispered, her voice laced with an eerie calm. Come with me. We can be together again. You've paid the price. You deserve this. For a moment, Thomas wavered. The thought of being with Alice, of escaping this nightmare, of atoning for his sins, it was too tempting, too easy. But as he stared into her eyes, he saw it. The truth. The price for his redemption had never been forgiveness. It had never been about making things right. The hollow didn't care about that. It only cared about the suffering he had caused, the suffering he had inflicted on others to appease his own desires. The only redemption here was eternal torment, an endless cycle of regret and pain. And so Thomas made his choice. No, he said, his voice trembling but firm. I can't take your hand. I can't let you pull me into the darkness with you. With those words, the world around him shattered. The hollow collapsed in on itself, the world spiraling into oblivion as Thomas was torn from the nightmare. But there was no escape, no salvation, only the knowledge that he had chosen to confront his sins, to face the consequences of his actions. But the cost was far greater than he could have ever imagined. In the final moments before everything vanished, Thomas saw it. Alice's face, twisted and broken, staring at him with eyes full of hatred. Her voice echoed one last time, filled with the same sorrowful accusation that had haunted him throughout his journey. "You could have saved me," she whispered, her voice fading into the void. "But you didn't." And then the darkness claimed him. Thomas was never seen again. The town remained a hollow shell, its broken remnants scattered across a desolate landscape. The hollow still stood, its surface reflecting the faces of those who had passed through it. Lost souls, condemned to repeat their mistakes for eternity. And somewhere, deep within the darkness, Thomas's name echoed, forever trapped in the void of his own making.
It began on a quiet, moonlit night. Mason had been driving for hours, his car slicing through the still desert air on a highway that seemed to stretch infinitely in both directions. His phone had lost signal hours ago, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the faint hum of static from the car radio. The road signs he passed bore no recognizable names, just cryptic symbols that grew stranger the further he drove. He had taken this detour at the recommendation of a gas station clerk who claimed it would shave hours off his journey. "Straight shot," the man had said, grinning. "Hardly anyone uses it anymore." Now, Mason wished he'd never listened. The asphalt glistened unnaturally under his headlights, as if it had just rained despite the sky remaining an uninterrupted canvas of stars. The world felt too quiet. No animals darted across the road, no distant glow of other vehicles approached. Just the endless black ribbon of highway and the oppressive weight of isolation. His eyes flicked to the fuel gauge. It was dipping lower than he had expected. "This can't be right," he muttered. The car seemed to devour fuel faster than normal, the needle creeping dangerously close to empty. Ahead, a faint, golden light appeared in the distance. Relief washed over him. Finally, some semblance of civilization. He pressed on the accelerator, the car surging forward. As Mason approached, the light resolved itself into a small roadside diner. Its neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a flickering glow over the cracked parking lot. "Last Stop Cafe," it read, though several of the letters were missing or burned out. He pulled in, parked, and stepped out of the car. The air smelled stale, as though it hadn't moved in decades. The diner's windows were fogged, obscuring the interior. Mason hesitated at the door before pushing it open. Inside, the diner was pristine, frozen in a 1950s aesthetic with checkered floors and red vinyl booths. A jukebox in the corner played a faint, distorted tune he didn't recognize. Yet it felt there were no other patrons. The clock on the wall read 12:01, but the second hand wasn't moving. Behind the counter, a man in a crisp white uniform smiled at Mason. "Welcome," the man said. His voice was calm, almost rehearsed. "Coffee? Pie? Just gas directions, actually," Mason replied. "My car's running on fumes." The man nodded slowly, as if processing the request took immense effort. "Everything you need is just down the road," he said, gesturing vaguely with one hand. Mason frowned. "There's no gas station here?" "No," the man replied simply. Unease prickled at Mason's skin, but he paid for a coffee out of politeness and left a tip on the counter. As he exited, he noticed something peculiar. The fuel gauge on his car, which had been near empty, was now back at half. He froze, staring at it. A low hum started, barely audible at first, but it seemed to emanate from the diner behind him. Mason turned back, but the building was gone. The parking lot was empty, and in its place was only more road. Shaking, he got back into the car and drove. The golden light reappeared less than an hour later. The same diner, the same neon sign, though now the letters were arranged differently. "Stop Last Cafe." "No," Mason whispered. "This can't be happening." His hands trembled on the steering wheel as he drove past, refusing to stop. Yet the further he drove, the more everything around him began to distort. The stars in the sky blinked unnaturally, as if someone had turned them on and off like light switches. The road itself wavered, its lines bending at impossible angles. He felt something behind him. A presence, heavy and cold, though his rearview mirror showed only the empty road. Suddenly, his headlights illuminated something up ahead, a figure standing in the center of the highway. Mason slammed the brakes, the tires screeching. The car lurched to a halt mere feet from the figure, which now stood motionless in the glare of his headlights. It was humanoid, but its proportions were wrong. Its arms were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It wore a tattered suit that seemed decades old, the fabric frayed and thin. The figure raised one skeletal hand and pointed past Mason, back toward the diner. Panicking, Mason reversed, but the car wouldn't move. The engine roared in protest, tires spinning uselessly on what now felt like glass instead of asphalt. The figure began to walk forward, its jerky, unnatural movements sending chills through Mason. He threw the car into drive and swerved around it, speeding down the highway as fast as he could. But the road had changed. The edges of the asphalt now crumbled into an endless black void. Faint whispers echoed around him, incoherent and maddening. A glance at his phone revealed the date had changed. 3 days had passed since he'd entered the highway. Then, the car came to an abrupt stop, though he hadn't touched the brakes. The engine sputtered and died, leaving him stranded in the middle of the endless, incomprehensible landscape. In the distance, he saw it, a towering structure on the horizon, glowing faintly. It was impossible to tell if it was close or far. The geometry of the space defied comprehension. He began to walk, leaving the car behind. The whispers grew louder, shaping into faint words. "You were never meant to leave." Mason walked forward, the structure in the distance pulsating faintly, its light unnatural and shifting. The whispers grew louder with each step, no longer vague but forming clear sentences. "You belong here now. No escape. We've been waiting." The words crawled under his skin, each syllable laced with malice. He tried to ignore them, focusing on the shimmering object ahead, but his feet dragged as if the road itself resisted his progress. The air felt thicker, pressing against him, and his breathing grew labored. The structure loomed closer, and its details became clearer. It wasn't a building. It was a tangle of roads and overpasses, impossibly stacked and connected in ways that made his head spin. Cars moved along these elevated paths, but they weren't cars he recognized. Their shapes were distorted, their movements too fluid, like living things mimicking machines. Mason hesitated, but the road behind him was gone, replaced by a vast, empty void. There was no turning back. He stepped onto the first ramp, the ground vibrating beneath his feet. As he moved deeper into the maze of overpasses, the voices grew deafening. Shadows flickered in the corners of his vision, humanoid shapes darting just out of sight. A car sped past him, its windows pitch black. He caught a glimpse of something inside, elongated faces with hollow eyes, their mouths stretched in silent screams. Mason stumbled back, his chest tightening in panic. "Stay on the road," a voice hissed directly into his ear. He spun around, but no one was there. He pressed on, his footsteps echoing unnaturally loud. The structure shifted as he moved, the ramps rearranging themselves. He realized, with growing dread, that he wasn't walking to anything. He was being led. The whispers turned into laughter, cruel and mocking. Figures began to emerge from the shadows, faceless, yet staring. They surrounded him, their movements synchronized like a choreographed nightmare. "Why are you doing this?" Mason shouted, his voice cracking. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a suffocating silence. One of the figures stepped forward, its featureless head tilting. "You chose the road," it said, its voice layered with countless others. "Now, the road chooses you." The ground beneath Mason's feet crumbled. He plummeted into darkness, his screams swallowed by the void. When Mason awoke, he was in his car, parked on the side of the highway. The sky was gray, the sun hidden behind thick clouds. He checked his phone. It was the same day, the same time he had taken the detour. But something was wrong. The road stretched ahead, endless and empty, just as before. Yet his rearview mirror reflected not the highway behind him but the twisting maze of overpasses. They stood impossibly far, shimmering like a mirage, but they were undeniably there. Mason turned the car around, determined to go back the way he came. But no matter how far he drove, the road ahead remained unchanged. He was trapped, the highway looping endlessly. The voices returned, faint at first, then growing louder. "You can't leave. The road is home now." Mason screamed, slamming his fists against the steering wheel. His headlights flickered, and for a brief moment, the figures appeared in the beam of light, motionless, waiting. The engine sputtered and died. Mason was left in silence, the whispers echoing around him as the shadows began to close in. Mason sat frozen, his breathing shallow as the darkness pressed in from all sides. The figures stood still, their faceless heads tilting in unison, as if studying him. The sound of his pulse filled his ears, each beat a drum of terror. He fumbled with the ignition, desperately twisting the key, but the engine refused to roar back to life. The whispers became a cacophony, words overlapping, meaningless but oppressive. The air in the car grew heavy, the temperature dropping sharply until his breath fogged the windshield. He reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Stay." The single word was loud, commanding, and it vibrated through the cabin of the car. The figures began to move, slow and deliberate, their footsteps echoing even though they left no marks on the asphalt. Mason's vision blurred as tears filled his eyes. He had nowhere to run, no escape. Then, with a sound like shattering glass, the windshield cracked. It wasn't a spider web of breaks. Instead, it formed a perfectly symmetrical symbol, a sigil that seemed to pulse with a sickly, pale light. Mason reached out involuntarily, his fingers brushing the cold glass. As soon as he touched the sigil, the car began to sink. The asphalt beneath it turned into a viscous, black sludge that bubbled and hissed. The figures surrounded the car, their featureless faces tilting down to watch him as he screamed, the sound swallowed by the sticky void. The car was pulled downward, inch by inch, the sludge seeping into the cabin through vents and cracks. It touched his skin, cold and alive, crawling up his arms like sentient vines. "No, let me go!" Mason thrashed, but it was futile. The sludge reached his chest, then his neck. Just as it began to cover his face, the world blinked out. Mason awoke again, lying on a road bathed in dim, sourceless light. The landscape was wrong. The highway stretched endlessly in both directions, but the sky above was a churning mass of dark green clouds. The air smelled metallic, and distant howls echoed, carried by an unnatural wind. He stood shakily, his body heavy and unresponsive. His car was gone. The figures were gone. But he wasn't alone. In the distance, he saw another person, or what appeared to be one. The figure was crouched by the roadside, its movements erratic, twitching as if malfunctioning. Mason hesitated, but the figure suddenly snapped its head up, locking its gaze, or what should have been a gaze, on him. It started running. Mason bolted down the road, his legs screaming in protest. The pavement beneath his feet felt wrong, soft and sticky, as if it were alive. He dared a glance behind him and saw the figure closing the distance, its limbs bending at impossible angles as it moved. The whispers returned, louder now, filling his head with their insidious words. "You belong. You can't leave. You chose this." Ahead, the road split into two paths. Mason didn't stop to think. He veered left, his heart pounding. But as he ran, he realized the path was narrowing, the sides of the road growing closer together. The walls began to rise, forming a tunnel of jagged asphalt. The figure behind him screamed, a high-pitched, distorted wail that made his ears ring. Mason pushed himself harder, the tunnel twisting and turning in impossible ways. The whispers grew louder, now accompanied by the rhythmic pounding of footsteps that weren't his own. The tunnel ended abruptly, and Mason burst into a vast open space. The road stopped at the edge of a massive pit, its depths swirling with an iridescent, otherworldly light. Mason skidded to a halt, his breath catching as he stared into the void. The whispers quieted, replaced by a deep, resonant hum. The pit seemed to call to him, its light pulsating in a hypnotic rhythm. Behind him, the figure slowed, its movements less frantic. Mason turned, his back to the pit, as the figure stopped a few feet away. It tilted its head, and for the first time, it spoke. "Jump." The word echoed in Mason's skull, louder than any sound he had ever heard. The edges of the pit glowed brighter, and the ground beneath him began to crumble. "No!" Mason shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the hum. The figure stepped closer, and Mason took a step back, too far. The edge gave way and he fell. The light consumed him, and everything went black. Mason's descent felt infinite, the world around him an endless void of shifting colors and oppressive silence. The sensation of falling wasn't consistent. At times, he felt weightless, suspended, as if he were floating in water. At other moments, he plummeted with the velocity of a meteor, his stomach lurching into his throat. The light from the pit dimmed as he fell further, replaced by a suffocating darkness that pressed against his skin. And then, with a jarring thud, he landed. The surface beneath him was cold and slick, like glass coated with oil. Mason groaned, his body aching from the impact. He pushed himself up onto his hands and knees, gasping for air that felt thick and heavy, each breath tasting faintly of rust. As his eyes adjusted, he realized he wasn't alone. Figures stood in the distance, silhouettes against a faint, unnatural glow that emanated from no discernible source. They were tall and spindly, their limbs too long and their movements unnervingly fluid. They moved without purpose, drifting like leaves caught in a breeze. Mason froze, his heart hammering. He tried to stay quiet, but his labored breathing felt deafening in the eerie silence. The figures didn't seem to notice him at first, but as he slowly began to back away, one stopped mid-motion. Its head, if it could be called that, snapped toward him, a jerky, unnatural movement. It began to approach, and the others followed, their movements synchronized like a hive mind. "No, no, no," Mason whispered, stumbling as he turned to run. The ground beneath him shifted with each step, rippling like liquid yet somehow solid enough to hold his weight. His footsteps echoed unnaturally, the sound bouncing back to him distorted and delayed. He ran toward the faint glow in the distance, hoping it led somewhere, anywhere, but the oppressive nothingness. The whispers returned, soft at first but quickly growing louder. They were different now, less a cacophony and more deliberate, as if multiple voices were chanting in unison. "You are here. You belong. There is no escape." Mason glanced over his shoulder and nearly tripped. The figures were faster than before, their movements now erratic, as if they were glitching through reality itself. One moment they were several yards away, and in the next, they were only a few feet behind him. Ahead, the glow grew brighter, revealing a massive structure that jutted out of the ground like a jagged monolith. Its surface was covered in pulsating, vein-like patterns, and the light seemed to come from within. Mason had no choice but to head toward it. As he neared, he saw an opening, a dark void in the side of the structure, beckoning him. Without hesitation, he dove inside, the whispers falling silent as the world outside vanished. Inside, the air was colder, and the oppressive darkness was absolute. Mason fumbled forward, his hands outstretched, until his fingers brushed against something smooth and cold. The walls of the tunnel were slick and slightly warm, pulsating beneath his touch like a living organism. A low hum filled the space, vibrating through his bones. It was rhythmic, like a heartbeat, and it grew louder the further he ventured. Mason's breath came in shallow gasps as he followed the tunnel, each step feeling heavier than the last. The path opened into a massive chamber, its size incomprehensible. The glow returned, faint and pulsating, revealing an enormous pit in the center of the room. The walls were lined with the same vein-like patterns, all converging at the pit's edge. Mason stepped closer, peering into the abyss. The light within swirled and shifted, forming shapes that almost resembled faces. They twisted and contorted, their expressions locked in silent screams. "Mason," he froze. The voice was clear, cutting through the hum like a knife. It wasn't a whisper, it was his mother's voice. "No," he muttered, backing away from the pit. "This isn't real." The light shifted again, forming another face. His father's. Then his sister's. One by one, every person he had ever known emerged from the swirling light, their eyes wide and pleading. "Join us." The figures from the road emerged from the tunnel behind him, their movements more frenzied now. They surrounded him, forcing him closer to the pit. Mason fought against them, but their grip was unyielding. As they pushed him to the edge, the light flared, and Mason's mind was flooded with memories, not his own, but fragments of lives lived and lost in this place. He saw others who had stumbled into this realm, each one meeting the same fate. He felt their pain, their despair, their terror. And then he understood. This was not a place he could escape. It was alive, feeding on those who entered, trapping them in an endless cycle of torment. The figures released him, and Mason fell forward, into the pit. The light consumed him, and the last thing he heard was his own voice, joining the chorus of whispers. Mason's fall was not a descent. It was an expulsion, a violent throw into the heart of a vast, unknowable dark. For what felt like an eternity, there was no ground, no end, just the rushing sound of wind and his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The cold air around him pressed in, suffocating, as if the very space was closing in on him. He tried to scream, but no sound left his throat. Then, just as suddenly, everything stopped. The motion, the sensation, the very rhythm of his pulse, it all halted in an instant. Mason was no longer falling. Instead, he was suspended in a thick, suffocating stillness. His eyes snapped open, but there was no point in trying to see. There was nothing to see. The light was gone, replaced by a crushing void. It was the kind of darkness that didn't just conceal the world. It consumed it entirely. His chest tightened. Where am I? The question lingered in his mind, but there was no answer. He could feel his limbs, but they felt alien, disconnected, as if they didn't belong to him. He reached out instinctively, but the air felt thick, like he was pushing through tar. And then, something scraped across his mind, like fingers brushing against the surface of his thoughts. "You're not alone." The voice was faint, almost a whisper. Yet it was everywhere, circling around him, seeping into the marrow of his bones. It was not one voice, but many layered on top of each other, some distorted, some unnaturally calm. The words, however, were clear. The sentence repeated over and over again, like a chant. "You're not alone." Mason's breath caught in his throat, panic swelling in his chest. His instincts screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. He couldn't even tell which direction to move, for the very space around him was still. Nothing was fixed. It was as if he were floating in a vast, immobile ocean. The space was too large, too infinite. It felt like the very concept of space itself was twisting, bending, warping. Then the voices intensified, now mixed with a strange buzzing, like static crawling under his skin. Something began to take shape in the dark. Figures. Dark, warped figures. At first, they were mere shadows, vague outlines. But then they came into focus, too quickly, too sharply. Their forms were tall, skeletal, their movements unnatural, like ragdolls jerked by invisible strings. They had no faces, just smooth, featureless heads. Their arms were stretched long and gnarled, fingers tipped with grotesque, sharpened nails that seemed to twitch with a life of their own. They surrounded him. No, they were everywhere, their presence expanding with every breath Mason took. His chest felt tight, his throat closing up. His limbs ached, weighed down by the sheer unnaturalness of the air around him. "You're not alone." The words had become a mantra, echoing endlessly in his mind, but the voices weren't just in his head anymore. They were all around him, surrounding him like a swarm of insects trapped in his skull. His vision began to blur as his thoughts started to unravel. The figures moved closer. They weren't just watching him, they were waiting. Mason's heart raced. Every part of him screamed for escape, but there was no way out. His body shook, his legs unable to hold him up. He crumpled to the ground, hands pressing against the cold, wet surface beneath him. Was it a floor? A ceiling? There was no way of knowing. The world was a mass of shifting shapes, every corner of his mind consumed by the twisting, distorted faces that were closing in. "It's too late," a voice said, but this one wasn't familiar. It wasn't a part of the chant. This voice was different, singular, and filled with a cruel clarity. Too late. Mason's head spun. He could feel his thoughts becoming fragmented, disjointed. He tried to focus, to understand, but the voices, They were relentless, repeating their phrase, their mantra. "You're not alone." And then, like a jolt of ice-cold water, it hit him. The pit. The thing that had pulled him in. The swirling, shifting mass of faces, calling to him, trapping him in an endless loop. He had entered it. He had fallen into this place. It wasn't just a room or a chamber. It was a trap. This was the heart of the endless nowhere, where time and reality distorted, where things were left to drift until they were absorbed, swallowed by the void. He tried to scream, but his voice was lost in the thick, suffocating air. No one could hear him here. No one could help him. He was trapped, suspended in the forever dark. Alone. Alone with the voices, with the things that watched him, that moved in the shadows. And they were coming for him. They were closing in. Mason's pulse quickened, his eyes wide with terror. The figures moved closer, their long fingers reaching out toward him. Their presence was suffocating, pressing in on him, their breath, or whatever it was, hot against his skin. His body trembled as one of them reached out, its fingers brushing against his arm. The coldness of its touch spread through his skin like venom, chilling him from the inside. His heart hammered wildly, but it was too late to move. Too late to run. The figures surrounded him, their shapes distorting, blending with the darkness. They pressed in, pulling him toward the endless void, their whispers deafening now. His mind fractured. He could feel himself slipping away, becoming a part of them. Becoming nothing. "You're not alone." The chant faded, swallowed by the abyss, leaving nothing but silence. Nothing but the hum, the endless, heart-shuddering hum that filled his mind until there was nothing left of Mason at all. Just the darkness. The whispers. The endless waiting. And then, nothing. The silence was crushing. It stretched on endlessly, the absence of sound almost unbearable. Mason's thoughts felt like they were unraveling, scattered like shards of glass in a vast, open space. His body, though physically present, felt like it no longer belonged to him. It was as if he had become part of the air around him, a mere presence, a flicker in the dark. The figures that surrounded him seemed to pause, as if assessing his very existence. Their grotesque, faceless heads tilted as they studied him. His breath was shallow, each inhale feeling like a battle against the heavy weight of the air. His skin tingled, and for a moment, it felt like he was being pulled from the inside out, as if his very essence was being unraveled by the touch of their fingers. "You're not alone," the voice echoed again, but this time, it wasn't just the chant, it was something deeper, something darker. The voices seemed to grow, merging into a single, unholy sound that reverberated within him, in his bones, in his very soul. Mason's body spasmed as if it were trying to escape the suffocating presence around him. His vision flickered. Was he seeing things? Were the shadows moving? The darkness around him began to warp, bending and twisting into shapes that no longer resembled reality. The walls, or whatever passed for walls here, seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like the inside of a living creature. Suddenly, one of the figures moved closer. Its elongated fingers brushed against his cheek. It was a touch that burned, that was cold and hot at the same time, as if the very touch of it was drawing the life from him. Mason gasped, his breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. His chest felt tight, constricted, and his vision blurred with the effort of staying conscious. "Please," he whispered, his voice breaking. But there was no mercy in the air, no compassion. The words that left his mouth were swallowed by the thick, suffocating void, and the figure did not react. It only leaned closer, its distorted face still a smooth, featureless mask. In that moment, Mason felt it, the hunger. It was not a hunger of the body, but of something far deeper. His mind recoiled, but there was no escaping it. His heart raced, not just from fear, but from the realization that he was being consumed. Slowly, piece by piece, bit by bit. The air was filled with the sickening buzz, like the hum of an old, malfunctioning machine, and it grew louder, drowning out all other sounds. The figure's fingers dug deeper into his skin, pulling something away. Something vital, something that had once been a part of him. His mind screamed, but no sound came. The figures around him closed in, moving as if in perfect unison, a grotesque dance of distortion and hunger. Every fiber of his being screamed for escape, but the void, the back room, was everywhere. It had no walls, no exit, no escape. And then, just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, the world shifted again. A sharp snap. The air around him twisted, as if reality itself was being bent into a new shape. The figures froze, their hands withdrawing as if the world itself had yanked them away from Mason. There was no warning. One moment they were there, and the next, they were gone. Mason stood alone in the dark once more. His heart thudded in his chest as the silence returned, but it was not the same. The silence was different now, thick with the weight of something unspeakable. The hum still lingered, vibrating through the very air. His body was drained, the pain from the touch of the figures still gnawing at him. His thoughts were fragmented, scattered, as if the experience had shattered his perception of time and space. He couldn't remember how long he had been here. Minutes? Hours? Days? How long have I been here? The question drifted through his mind, but he couldn't find the answer. The darkness had no end. The hunger had no end. Suddenly, he felt the presence again. It was subtle at first, a distant flicker in the corner of his vision. He turned, expecting to see one of them. But nothing. Only the endless dark. Then he felt it in his chest, a pull. Something was drawing him forward. He didn't know why, but his feet moved against his will. The ground beneath him, if it could even be called ground, seemed to shift as he walked. There was no direction, no clear path. Just the pull, like a thread tugging him along, unraveling him further. He moved deeper into the dark, each step heavier than the last. The air thickened, pressing in on him, suffocating. The sound of his own footsteps echoed back at him, distorted, wrong. And then, there it was. A flicker of light in the distance. It was faint, a dull, sickly glow. But it was enough. Enough to draw him forward, to make him hope. He was too far gone, too desperate to resist. Mason stumbled toward the light, his feet dragging through the thick, oppressive air. Each step felt like wading through molasses, like the world was resisting him, pushing back against his every movement. The light grew brighter as he got closer, until it was blinding. The oppressive weight of the dark was lifted, just for a moment, and he could see something in front of him. Something beyond the void. It was a door. A simple door. It didn't belong here, didn't belong in this twisted place. It was wooden, with peeling paint, like something you'd find in an old house. But this was no house. This was the back room. His hand trembled as he reached for the door handle. What would happen if he opened it? Was this the escape? Or was it something worse? The light pulsed again, as if calling him, urging him forward. His heart beat faster, louder in his chest. There was no more time for hesitation. The darkness around him seemed to tighten, closing in like jaws of a beast ready to swallow him whole. Mason's hand touched the handle, and the world fell away again. Mason's hand gripped the door handle with a force that felt alien to him. He could feel his pulse hammering through his veins, his body trembling with a mix of fear and anticipation. The light beyond the door flickered once more, blinding him momentarily before it steadied into a steady, pulsating glow. For a split second, he almost felt a sense of safety, as though the door could be his salvation. But deep down, something whispered that no door here would ever truly lead to freedom. His fingers tightened on the cold, rusted metal of the handle. He had no choice. He had to open it. If there was any hope of escaping, this door was it. He turned the knob slowly, the creak of the hinges echoing in the suffocating silence that surrounded him. As he pulled the door open, a wave of stale, putrid air slammed into him, the stench of rot and decay seeping through the cracks. And then, for a fleeting moment, it seemed like he was somewhere else. The room he entered was identical to the road, an endless stretch of dimly lit hallway, the same beige wallpaper, the same oppressive air, but somehow more real. The oppressive weight that had hung over him for what seemed like eternity seemed to lift, even if only a little. The walls around him were peeling, the floor sticky with something he dared not think about. The lights flickered intermittently, casting harsh shadows that seemed to move just out of the corner of his eye. But the hallway stretched out before him, just like the road had. It was endless, and the further he looked, the less certain he was of its boundaries. The space seemed to warp and shift, just like the back room he had been trapped in. Mason stepped forward, his boots sinking slightly into the sticky floor. Each step was weighed down by the dread that gnawed at him, but his feet carried him forward, drawn by an invisible pull. Was it hope? Or was it something darker? The hallway stretched and stretched. The walls seemed to close in around him, suffocating the air from his lungs. The light dimmed, flickering erratically, until it finally stabilized. It became a sharp, unnatural glow, colder now, more like the light from the back room. His heart began to race again, the terror creeping back. His mind felt fragmented, each thought splintering and cracking under the strain. It was then that he saw them. Figures. Figures that he had seen before. The faceless, distorted beings that had surrounded him earlier. They stood at the far end of the hallway, their long, bony fingers twitching unnervingly. Their shapes were hard to comprehend, like shadowy silhouettes that bent and warped as they moved. No eyes, no faces, only that unnatural stillness that made Mason's skin crawl. For a brief moment, Mason thought he could turn back. But as soon as the thought entered his mind, the hallway seemed to stretch longer, the space between him and the figures growing shorter in an instant. They were closing in. There was no way out. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. But there was no mercy, no response. The figures simply began to move toward him. The lights flickered again, and Mason's body froze as he realized what was happening. He was trapped. Trapped again. But this time, there was no back room to escape to. No way to avoid the inevitable. His legs felt heavy, as though his very muscles were being dragged down by some unseen force. His breath came in short, panicked gasps as he tried to move. His fingers twitched, desperate to find something to cling to. But there was nothing. The hallway was empty, save for the ever-approaching figures that continued to glide toward him. One of them reached out, its fingers long and unnaturally bent. It grazed the side of Mason's face, sending a jolt of pain and cold through his body. His vision blurred, his mind fractured as the pain washed over him. It was like nothing he had ever felt, an agony that spread, creeping through his veins, suffocating him from the inside out. Mason gasped, the weight of the moment crashing down on him. This was it. The figures surrounded him, their cold touch seeping deeper and deeper into his skin. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They were taking him, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. Mason's limbs began to grow numb, his chest tightening as his consciousness began to slip away. He could feel his life draining from him, fading, swallowed by the dark. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the faintest flicker of light in the distance. A door. Another door. But it was too far. The hallway had closed, the figures had closed in, and there was nowhere left to run. Mason's vision faded, his body growing cold as the last shred of his awareness slipped away. And then there was nothing. Silence. Complete, suffocating silence. Somewhere far, far away, the world continued turning, blissfully unaware of the horrors unfolding on the forgotten road, on the edge of the backrooms. But for Mason, the endless hallway, the figures, and the never-ending dread were all that remained. And they would remain forever.
Highways stretch like veins through the world's hidden darkness. This is another tale from the shadows. A road where fear runs deep, and not every passenger is alive. The following account is transcribed from the interview logs of Officer Daniel Graves, recorded 6 months after his resignation from the force. His words, unsteady and fragmented, were given during an internal investigation into the infamous Silent Mile disappearances. You think it's just a story, don't you? Some cautionary tale to keep folks from driving alone at night. I used to think the same thing, thought it was all nonsense, rumors spread by truckers too tired to know reality from a bad dream. But I saw it, I lived it, and it left me with scars I can't explain and memories I wish I could burn. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. Routine welfare check, the dispatcher said. A woman had reported a stopped car with its hazards on and someone lying in the road near mile marker 198. She claimed she almost hit him, but when she got out to help, he was gone. No sign of him, just skid marks and a smell she couldn't describe, like burnt metal. She was spooked, and I can't blame her. People don't just disappear. I was the closest unit, so I headed that way. I'd driven that stretch of Highway 61 more times than I could count. It's a dead zone for cell service, surrounded by nothing but flat fields and skeletal trees. Most folks avoid it after dark. Too many deer and not enough lights. But I didn't think twice about it. I was an officer of the law, and this was my job. The first thing I noticed was the silence. My patrol car's engine hummed steady, but it felt muted, like the sound didn't carry. Even the wind had stopped. It was unnatural, oppressive, the kind of quiet that presses against your skull until you feel like screaming just to break it. When I reached mile marker 198, I slowed down. Sure enough, there was a car parked on the shoulder, hazards blinking weakly in the dark. A black sedan, doors shut, windows up. No sign of anyone around. I pulled up behind it, keeping my headlights on. Procedure, you know? Keep the area lit, make yourself visible. But as I stepped out of my car, I felt it. The kind of chill that sinks into your bones and doesn't let go. I called out, "Police! Anyone here?" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the night. No response. I approached the car, hand on my holster just in case. The driver's seat was empty, but the keys were still in the ignition. The smell hit me next, faint but sharp, like something burning. I shined my flashlight inside. Nothing out of place, just an old fast food bag and a jacket thrown over the passenger seat. But then I noticed the rearview mirror. It was angled toward the back seat. My stomach dropped. Why would anyone adjust it like that? I stepped back, circling around to check the trunk. That's when I saw the footprints. Bare feet, small like a child's, leading away from the car into the field. I called it in, but all I got was static. No response from dispatch, just a crackling noise that made my skin crawl. I should have waited for backup. Hell, I should have left right then and there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone needed help. I followed the tracks, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The field stretched on forever, the grass waist-high and swaying even though there was no wind. The footprints led to a patch of flattened grass, and in the center of it, I found something. A doll, old, dirty, with one eye missing. Its dress was torn, and its plastic limbs were scratched like it had been dragged through gravel. I don't know why, but touching it felt wrong, like I was breaking some unspoken rule. That's when I heard it. A faint laugh, high-pitched and echoing, coming from somewhere ahead. My blood ran cold. I called out again, "This is the police. Show yourself." The laugh stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but that suffocating silence again. Then I saw the light. It was faint at first, flickering in the distance, like someone holding a lantern. I started toward it, my hand gripping my flashlight so tight my knuckles ached. As I got closer, the light seemed to retreat, always staying just out of reach. I shouted, demanded whoever it was to stop, but they didn't listen. They just kept moving, leading me deeper into the field. The grass began to thin, giving way to dirt. The smell grew stronger, acrid and metallic. That's when I saw it. A second car half buried in the earth. Its frame was rusted, the windows shattered. It looked like it had been there for decades, but the license plate was still visible. My flashlight caught it, and my breath caught in my throat. It was the same plate as the sedan back on the road. The exact same plate. I felt a presence then, behind me, the kind of feeling you can't explain, like when someone's staring at the back of your head. I spun around, and my flashlight flickered. In the brief moments of light, I saw them. Figures, pale and gaunt, standing in the grass. Their faces were blank. No eyes, no mouths, just smooth skin. They didn't move, but I felt their gaze. My legs locked up. I couldn't run, couldn't scream. All I could do was watch as they closed in. And then nothing. I woke up in my patrol car, parked back on the highway. The sun was rising, and the sedan was gone. Dispatch said they lost contact with me for hours. No sign of the woman who called it in, no evidence of a second car. Just me, alone, with dirt under my nails and that damn doll sitting in the passenger seat. After that night, things weren't the same. I tried to tell myself it was exhaustion, maybe a hallucination brought on by stress, but the evidence didn't add up. The dirt under my nails, the scratches on my arms, the doll. It was all real. I handed the doll over to forensics, thinking they'd find something. But when they opened the evidence bag a day later, it was gone. Just gone like it had never existed. I should have let it go, but I couldn't. I started digging into the history of that stretch of Highway 61. Officially, there's nothing remarkable about it. No accidents, no major crimes. But the locals, truckers, farmers, drifters, they told a different story. They called it the Silent Mile, said it was cursed, that people who stopped there didn't always come back. One name kept popping up: Margaret Lorne. She owned a farmhouse near mile marker 198 in the late 1940s. According to local legend, she lost her daughter in a car accident on the highway. They say she spent years walking the road at night, carrying a lantern, looking for the driver who hit her child and fled the scene. She died alone in her home, but sightings of her light began not long after. And the strangest part? The truckers swore that if you saw the light and followed it, you'd end up somewhere you weren't supposed to be. I didn't want to believe it, but the more I read, the more everything fit. The lantern, the laughter, the doll. It all pointed to her. I had to know for sure. I took another drive out there, this time during the day. It felt different in the sunlight, ordinary, almost peaceful. I parked near mile marker 198 and searched the fields. That's when I found the ruins of Margaret's farmhouse. The walls were crumbling, overgrown with weeds, but the foundation was intact. And in the rubble, I found a metal box. Inside were old photos, yellowed with age. One of them showed a little girl holding the very same doll I'd found in the field. Another showed Margaret, standing in front of the farmhouse with a stern expression and a lantern in hand. The last photo was different. It was burned around the edges, the image distorted, but I could make out two cars on the highway and a smear of red between them. A crash. My stomach turned. This wasn't just a story. It was a warning. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, or what was left of it. I tried to shake it off, but the sense of dread wouldn't leave. Around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed. An unknown number. I shouldn't have answered, but I did. Static filled the line, and then a voice. Soft, almost a whisper. "Come back." I froze, the phone slipping from my hand. The voice was hers. It had to be, but she was dead. This was impossible. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe I'd opened a door I couldn't close. Against every instinct, I got dressed, grabbed my flashlight, and drove back to the Silent Mile. The highway was darker than I remembered, the silence heavier. When I reached mile marker 198, I stopped the car and stepped out. The chill in the air was the same, biting and unnatural. I called out into the night, "Margaret, I know what you want. I'm here to help." No response, just the wind rustling through the grass. Then I saw it again, the light. It flickered on the horizon, faint and steady, like a heartbeat. I followed it just like before. The path through the field felt familiar, but this time, the air grew thicker, harder to breathe. The light led me back to the second car, still half buried in the dirt. But now there was something else. A figure kneeling next to the wreckage. She turned slowly, and for the first time, I saw her face clearly. Her skin was pale and translucent, her eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. She didn't speak, but I felt her anger, her grief, pressing down on me like a weight. She pointed to the car, and in that moment I understood. She wanted justice. She wanted to be heard. But there was something she didn't realize, something I hadn't pieced together until it was too late. The crash that killed her daughter wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. And the driver? He was never caught because he disappeared into the Silent Mile himself. Margaret wasn't just a victim. She was a warden, keeping those who wronged her family trapped in this purgatory. And now I was part of it. The realization hit me like a freight train. The Silent Mile wasn't just haunted. It was a trap, a spider's web spun from grief and vengeance. Margaret wasn't leading me to answers. She was pulling me deeper into her world. The light from her lantern flared brighter, illuminating the wreckage of the second car. Rusted metal twisted into jagged shapes, bloodstains long dried on the upholstery, and shattered glass gleaming like broken stars. I could hear faint whispers now, like the voices of the dead tangled in the wind. "I can't help you," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I don't belong here." Margaret's expression didn't change, but the air around her grew colder, the pressure heavier. She raised her lantern, and suddenly the field began to shift. The tall grass swayed violently, and the ground beneath my feet softened as if I were sinking into the earth itself. The wreckage of the car started to move, groaning as if alive, pulling itself free of the dirt. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering wildly. Shapes began to emerge from the shadows, indistinct at first, but then more defined. Faces, dozens of them, men, women, children, all of them pale and gaunt, their eyes dark pits of emptiness. They surrounded me, silent and unmoving, their hollow gazes fixed on me. "Stop!" I screamed, my voice breaking. "I didn't do anything." But Margaret stepped closer, her lantern burning brighter, its flame unnatural and blue. She pointed at me, and the faces of the dead turned in unison. Their mouths opened, releasing a chorus of anguished cries that pierced the air, each one a fragment of pain and fury. I fell to my knees, clutching my ears, but the sound burrowed into my skull, a relentless tide of torment. Through the cacophony, Margaret spoke, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "You see it now, their suffering, their end. This is justice. It wasn't me," I shouted, tears streaming down my face. "I'm not the one you're looking for." Her gaze bore into me, unyielding. "You stepped into the mile. You carry its weight. The guilty, the complicit, the silent. All are bound here." I tried to crawl away, but the ground beneath me shifted, turning to soft, clinging mud that swallowed my hands and knees. The faces of the dead grew closer, their features contorted with anguish, their hands reaching out, skeletal and cold. Each touch burned, searing my skin and drawing out memories I didn't know I had. Images of accidents I'd ignored, of times I turned away instead of helping. Margaret wasn't just a spirit of vengeance. She was a judge, and the Silent Mile was her courtroom. "Please," I begged, my voice hoarse, "I'll do whatever you want. Just let me go." Margaret tilted her head, her expression unreadable. The faces around me stopped their advance, their cries fading into a heavy silence. She raised her lantern higher, its light illuminating the entirety of the field. The second car was now fully unearthed, its broken frame gleaming with malice. Inside, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. A figure slumped over the wheel, its features obscured but eerily familiar. "Look," Margaret commanded, her voice low and cold. "See the truth." Against my will, my body moved, dragging itself toward the car. The figure in the driver's seat became clearer with each step, and dread twisted in my stomach like a knife. When I reached the window, I wiped away the grime with a trembling hand. My breath caught in my throat. It was me. The driver's face was unmistakable, a perfect replica of my own, frozen in a rictus of horror. Blood streaked down its temple, and its lifeless eyes stared blankly ahead. I stumbled back, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a trick, a hallucination. "You were always part of this," Margaret said, her voice echoing with finality. "You just didn't know it yet." The faces of the dead began to close in again, their hands reaching for me with renewed fervor. The car's engine roared to life, though it was impossible. It was nothing but a rusted husk. The headlights flared, blinding me, and the ground beneath me gave way entirely. I fell into darkness, the screams of the dead swallowing me whole. When I woke up, I was lying on the side of the highway, my clothes soaked in mud and my skin covered in scratches. My car was gone, and so was the doll, the lantern, everything. A passing trucker spotted me and called for help. The paramedics said I was lucky to be alive, but I couldn't tell them what had really happened. They wouldn't have believed me. I stayed silent, but the silent mile hasn't left me. Every time I close my eyes, I see her lantern, hear the whispers, feel the cold hands pulling me under. I've tried to move on, to forget, but it's always there, waiting. I know someday I'll have to go back, not for justice, not for answers, but because once you enter the mile, you're never truly free. Weeks have passed since the silent mile, yet the weight of that night refuses to lift. My nights are plagued with vivid dreams, or memories. I can't tell anymore. Margaret's eyes, pale and unyielding, stare at me in every reflective surface. I've stopped looking in mirrors. Every shadow feels too close. Every whisper of the wind carries fragments of her voice. I thought distance would help, but no matter how far I drive, it's like I'm still on that cursed stretch of road. Today, I decided to face it head-on. If the mile has claimed me, if Margaret still watches, then there has to be a reason. I need to understand. Armed with a new car, a flashlight, and enough courage to fill a teaspoon, I drove back. I don't know what I was expecting. Closure? Redemption? Instead, I found only more questions. The silent mile wasn't marked on any map. I realized that after hours of scanning digital and printed charts, searching for the unassuming detour that had swallowed me whole. The trucker who saved me mentioned no strange roads, no eerie detours. As far as he knew, I was found on a perfectly ordinary stretch of highway. Yet, when I set out today, I found the entrance almost too easily, as though the road wanted me back. The air changed the moment I crossed its threshold. It was subtle at first, a drop in temperature, the way the light faded despite the cloudless sky. Soon, the oppressive silence enveloped me again, pressing against my chest. The surroundings blurred, trees and landmarks dissolving into a gray haze. It was like driving into a dream or a nightmare. I passed the abandoned gas station, the same one from before, though it looked older now, more decrepit. The neon sign flickered weakly, but this time, no figure stood at the pumps. I didn't stop, couldn't. I drove for hours, or maybe it was minutes. Time lost meaning. The whispers started as faint murmurs, barely audible over the hum of the engine. I turned the radio off, but they grew louder. Words I couldn't understand, voices overlapping in a chorus of sorrow and rage. And then I saw her. Margaret stood in the middle of the road, her lantern held high. Its light was steady this time, a cold, unearthly glow. She didn't move as I approached, forcing me to slow down. I stopped a few feet away, the car idling. My hands trembled on the wheel, but I couldn't look away. The faces of the dead emerged from the shadows, lining the road on either side. They didn't attack, didn't wail or scream. They just watched. Their hollow eyes bore into me, and for the first time, I felt something beyond fear. Guilt. Margaret stepped closer, her lantern swinging with each step. When she reached my window, I rolled it down, my throat dry and heart hammering. "Why am I here?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Her gaze was steady, unyielding. "You know why?" I shook my head, tears welling in my eyes. "I don't. I swear. I don't understand." The lantern flared, and suddenly, I was no longer in the car. I was standing on the roadside, the tall grass brushing against my legs. Around me, the dead stared, their presence heavy and suffocating. Margaret stood before me, her expression unreadable. "You carry their weight," she said. "You always have." The field began to shift, the ground beneath me rippling like water. The wreckage of cars surfaced one by one, their twisted frames telling stories of despair. Voices rose around me. Pleas for help, cries of anguish, curses of the forgotten. "What do you want from me?" I cried. Margaret stepped closer, her lantern illuminating my face. Her free hand reached out, her fingers icy as they brushed against my temple. "Remember," she whispered. The memories hit me like a tidal wave. Accidents I'd passed without stopping. Cries for help I'd ignored. A hitchhiker left stranded in the rain. Each moment played out vividly, searing into my mind like brands. I had been complicit in their suffering, not through action but through inaction. The mile wasn't just punishing those who caused pain, it was holding everyone accountable. Margaret's voice was soft but firm. Will you face your guilt, or will you run again? The dead closed in, their whispers growing louder. My knees buckled, and I collapsed, sobbing into the dirt. I'm sorry, I choked out. I'm so sorry. Margaret's expression softened, though her lantern still burned cold and bright. Around me, the dead hesitated, their movements faltering as though my words had pierced the veil of their rage. But forgiveness, I realized, would not come so easily. The ground beneath me heaved, and the wreckage of countless cars began to sink back into the earth, swallowed by the shadows. The voices of the dead became a deafening roar, their anguish morphing into something darker. My heart pounded as the specters surged forward, their translucent hands outstretched, grasping for me. Stop! I screamed, scrambling backward. I'm sorry. I'll change. I swear I'll change. Margaret raised her lantern high, and the spirits froze. For a moment, all was still. Then she spoke, her voice calm and commanding. Your words are empty unless you prove them. Redemption comes through sacrifice. The lantern's light flared, blinding me. When my vision cleared, I was back in my car, the engine silent, the road stretching endlessly ahead. Margaret stood before the hood, her lantern dim now, casting only a faint glow. Her voice echoed in my mind. The choice is yours. Continue your path and remain a prisoner of your guilt, or free them by surrendering yourself. My breath came in shallow gasps. The weight of her words crushed me. Could I atone for my sins by giving everything? Or was this another test, another cruel twist of the mile? I reached for the ignition, hands trembling. As the engine roared to life, Margaret shook her head slowly, disappointment etched into her ethereal face. You've chosen. The car lurched forward, the dead lining the road dissipating like smoke. But they weren't gone. I could feel their rage, their despair clinging to me like a second skin. The mile stretched on, its end nowhere in sight. My mind raced, my heart a thunderous drumbeat in my chest. The road began to twist and turn, impossible bends and slopes defying all logic. The car skidded, tires squealing as I fought to keep control. Shadows clawed at the windows, their faces pressing against the glass. I'm sorry, I screamed again, tears streaming down my face. The lantern's light appeared ahead, growing brighter, blinding me once more. The car slammed into something unseen, the impact throwing me forward. When I woke, I was surrounded by emergency lights. Paramedics worked frantically, their voices muffled and distant. My car was a crumpled wreck at the base of a ravine, its frame twisted beyond recognition. A police officer leaned over me, his face pale. You're lucky to be alive, he said. I tried to speak, but my throat was raw. They carried me to the ambulance, and as I was loaded inside, I caught a glimpse of the ravine. In the wreckage, illuminated by flashing red and blue lights, stood Margaret. She held her lantern high, her expression unreadable. As the doors closed, her form dissolved into the shadows, leaving me with one final, chilling thought. The silent mile never truly ends.